The documentation of Ragnarok's prophetic narrative emerges from a complex web of medieval Icelandic manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, and centuries of oral transmission that collectively preserve one of the most detailed apocalyptic visions in world mythology. Understanding these sources requires careful examination of their historical contexts, authorship, and the cultural forces that shape their preservation during Christianity's expansion across Scandinavia. The poetic Edda, particularly the Völuspá or Prophecy of the Seeress, stands as the most comprehensive and haunting account of the world's end in Norse literature. This collection of anonymous poems, compiled in the 13th century Codex Regius manuscript, presents the Ragnarok narrative through the voice of a Volva, a female seer who recounts both the creation and destruction of the cosmos to Odin himself. The Volva's prophecy unfolds in 66 stanzas of Fornadislag meter, describing the gradual moral decay that precedes the final battle, the deaths of gods, and the eventual rebirth of the world. The manuscript evidence suggests these poems circulated orally for centuries before their written preservation. Linguistic analysis reveals archaic grammatical structures and vocabulary that predate the manuscript by several hundred years, indicating the poem's roots extend deep into the pre-Christian period. The Völuspá's treatment of Ragnarok differs markedly from later Christian interpretations, presenting a cyclical rather than linear view of time, where destruction leads inevitably to renewal. Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, composed around 1220, provides the second major textual source through its Gylfaginning section, which translates as the beguiling of Gylfi. Sturluson, writing as both historian and literary artist, systematized the scattered mythological references found in skaldic poetry into a coherent narrative framework. His account of Ragnarok draws heavily from the Völuspá, but expands certain details while omitting others, creating a version that reflects both scholarly methodology and the author's Christian worldview. Sturluson's treatment reveals the tension between preserving pagan traditions and conforming to medieval Christian sensibilities. He frames the entire mythological corpus as the mistaken beliefs of ancient peoples who misunderstood divine truth, yet his detailed preservation of these errors suggests genuine scholarly interest in documenting Iceland's cultural heritage. The Gylfaginning presents Ragnarok through a dialogue between the disguised Odin and King Gylfi, allowing Sturluson to maintain narrative distance while providing extensive detail about the god's fates. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia corroborates the textual sources while revealing regional variations in eschatological beliefs. The Gosforth Cross in Cumbria, England, carved by Norse settlers in the 10th century, depicts scenes that scholars interpret as Ragnarok imagery, including bound figures that may represent Loki's punishment and intertwined serpents reminiscent of Jormungandr. The cross's Christian symbolism overlays these pagan motifs, demonstrating the syncretic religious practices of converted Norse communities. Runestone inscriptions provide additional evidence of pre-Christian apocalyptic thinking. The rock stone in Östergötland, Sweden, dating to the early 9th century, contains cryptic references to cosmic destruction and renewal that parallel Ragnarok themes. The stone's runic text mentions the destruction of the sanctuary and alludes to supernatural battles, though the fragmentary nature of runic inscriptions makes definitive interpretation challenging. Similar eschatological references appear on stones throughout Denmark and Norway, suggesting widespread familiarity with end times narratives across Germanic-speaking regions. The material culture of Viking Age Scandinavia reveals additional layers of Ragnarok symbolism. Weapons and jewellery frequently feature motifs associated with the final battle. Wolves, ravens, serpents, and bound figures appear repeatedly in metalwork from the 8th through 11th centuries. The Mammon axe from Denmark, decorated with intricate interlace patterns and animal figures, includes imagery that some scholars interpret as references to the cosmic wolf Fenrir. These artifacts suggest that Ragnarok themes permeated daily life rather than remaining confined to ritual or literary contexts. Comparative analysis with other Indo-European traditions reveals shared structural elements that illuminate the deeper origins of Norse eschatology. The Zoroastrian concept of cosmic renewal through fire, preserved in texts like the Bundahishan, parallels the conflagration that consumes the Nine Worlds during Ragnarok. Both traditions envision a final battle between forces of order and chaos, followed by the resurrection of the dead and the establishment of a purified world order. Hindu cosmology, as described in texts like the Vishnu Purana, presents cyclical time concepts that mirror Norse beliefs about world ages and cosmic renewal. The kalpas, or world periods that end in destruction and rebirth, find echoes in the Voluspa's description of multiple world cycles. These parallels suggest common Proto-Indo-European roots for apocalyptic thinking, though the specific details reflect each culture's unique historical experiences and environmental conditions. Celtic traditions preserve similar themes in texts like the Irish Lebor Gabala Érenn, which describes successive invasions and transformations of Ireland that parallel the cyclical destruction and renewal found in Norse sources. The Welsh Mabinogion contains references to cosmic battles and world-ending conflicts that share structural similarities with Ragnarok narratives, though the specific details differ significantly. The oral transmission of Ragnarok stories across Germanic peoples created a dynamic tradition that adapted to local conditions, while maintaining core narrative elements. Evidence from Anglo-Saxon England, preserved in poems like Beowulf and the fragmentary Valdare, reveals apocalyptic themes that parallel Norse sources while reflecting the specific historical experiences of Germanic settlers in Britain. The concept of weird or fate that pervades Anglo-Saxon literature echoes the inexorable destiny that drives the Norse gods toward their doom. Continental Germanic traditions, though less well preserved due to earlier Christianization, retain traces of similar eschatological beliefs. The Old High German Muspelli fragment describes a cosmic fire that will consume the world, using terminology that cognates with Norse references to Muspelheim, the realm of fire that plays a crucial role in Ragnarok. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements along the Rhine and Danube rivers includes artifacts with motifs similar to those found in Scandinavian contexts, suggesting shared symbolic vocabularies for expressing apocalyptic concepts. The preservation of Ragnarok narratives in Iceland reflects that island's unique position as a repository of Germanic cultural memory. Iceland's settlement by Norwegian chieftains fleeing Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power created a diaspora community motivated to preserve traditional knowledge and practices. The island's isolation from continental European political and religious pressures allowed these traditions to survive in forms closer to their pre-Christian origins than elsewhere in the Germanic world. The role of skalds, professional poets attached to royal courts, proved crucial in maintaining the integrity of mythological narratives across generations. These poets employed complex metrical systems and elaborate kenning structures that served as mnemonic devices while requiring extensive mythological knowledge for proper interpretation. The preservation of skaldic poetry in Sturluson's Edda demonstrates how professional bardic traditions maintained detailed knowledge of Ragnarok themes well into the Christian period. Women's roles in preserving and transmitting eschatological knowledge deserve particular attention, given the prominence of female seers in Norse sources. The Volva tradition, which placed prophetic authority in the hands of women, created alternative channels for preserving religious knowledge outside male-dominated institutional structures. Archaeological evidence of female graves containing staffs, amulets, and other ritual objects associated with Seeder magic suggests these women held genuine social authority as religious specialists. The transformation of Ragnarok narratives during the conversion period reveals the complex negotiations between pagan and Christian worldviews that characterized medieval Scandinavia. Rather than simple replacement of old beliefs with new ones, the evidence suggests a prolonged period of syncretism where Christian and pagan elements coexisted and influenced each other. The preservation of detailed pagan mythology in Christian manuscripts reflects this complex cultural dynamic, where traditional knowledge retained value even within new religious frameworks. Regional variations in Ragnarok traditions demonstrate the flexibility of oral culture in adapting core narratives to local conditions and concerns. Norwegian versions, preserved in sources like Snorri's Heimskringla, emphasize the role of kings and earthly rulers in the cosmic drama, reflecting that region's political centralization. Danish traditions, evidenced in Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, incorporate historical conflicts with Slavic and Germanic neighbours into eschatological frameworks, showing how contemporary events shaped mythological understanding. The intricate cosmological structure that houses the Ragnarok narrative extends far beyond simple geographical boundaries, encompassing a complex metaphysical architecture where divine realms, mortal worlds, and primordial forces exist in delicate interdependence. This cosmic framework centres on Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose massive trunk and sprawling branches serve as both the physical axis connecting all existence and the spiritual conduit through which fate, wisdom, and destruction flow toward their inevitable convergence. Yggdrasil stands as an ash tree of unimaginable proportions, its roots penetrating the deepest foundations of reality, while its crown extends beyond the highest heavens. The tree's name derives from Ygg's gallows, referencing Odin's self-sacrifice when he hung from its branches for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge of the runes. This etymology immediately establishes the tree's dual nature as both life-giver and death-bringer, a cosmic entity that nurtures existence while simultaneously harbouring the seeds of its destruction. The world tree's physical structure defies conventional understanding of botanical growth. Its trunk measures so vast that no mortal eye can perceive its full circumference, while its bark appears as a living tapestry of interwoven patterns that shift and change according to the cosmic forces flowing through its heartwood. The tree's leaves shimmer with an otherworldly luminescence, each one containing the reflected light of stars, moons, and suns from across the 9 realms. When these leaves fall, they carry with them fragments of divine knowledge that scatter across the worlds below, seeding both wisdom and prophecy in their wake. 3 primary roots anchor Yggdrasil to the fundamental forces of existence. The first root extends into Asgard, drawing sustenance from the Well of Erd, where the Norns weave the fates of gods and mortals alike. This root appears as a massive column of living wood, whose surface bears the scars and markings of every significant event in cosmic history. The second root reaches into Jotunheim, tapping the Well of Mimir, where the severed head of the wisest being in creation continues to dispense knowledge to those worthy of its counsel. The third root descends into the primordial realm of Niflheim, drawing from Hvergelmir, the spring from which all cold waters flow and where the dragon Nidhogger gnaws eternally at the root's base. The tree's branches create a network of pathways that allow travel between the realms, though these routes remain accessible only to divine beings, spirits, and those mortals granted special permission by the gods. The branches themselves pulse with a visible energy that resembles flowing sap but contains the concentrated essence of cosmic forces. Where major branches intersect, the accumulated power creates nodes of intense magical activity that serve as gathering points for supernatural beings and as focal points for significant mythological events. Living creatures inhabit every level of Yggdrasil's structure, each species playing a specific role in maintaining cosmic balance. The eagle that perches in the tree's crown surveys all 9 realms with eyes that can perceive the threads of fate as they weave through time and space. Between the eagle's eyes sits a hawk named Vedrafolnir, whose keen vision penetrates even deeper into the mysteries of existence. These aerial guardians serve as the tree's sensory network, detecting threats and changes that might affect cosmic stability. 4 stags bound through the tree's upper branches, feeding on its leaves and buds while their movement creates the winds that blow across all realms. Their names, Dain, Dvalin, Dunair and Durathor, reflect different aspects of death and dormancy, suggesting their role in the gradual weakening of the world tree as Ragnarok approaches. As they consume more of the tree's foliage, the cosmic winds they generate become increasingly chaotic and destructive, contributing to the environmental upheavals that herald the end times. The dragon Nidhogger represents the most direct threat to Yggdrasil's continued existence. This massive serpentine creature dwells among the roots in Niflheim, its powerful jaws constantly working to sever the tree's connection to its foundational sources of power. Nidhogger's scales appear black as the void between stars, while its eyes burn with the cold fire of entropy itself. The dragon's relentless gnawing creates a continuous weakening of the world tree's structural integrity, making the entire cosmic framework increasingly vulnerable to the catastrophic forces that will ultimately bring about its collapse. A squirrel named Ratatoska scurries up and down Yggdrasil's trunk, carrying messages between the eagle in the crown and the dragon at the roots. This seemingly minor creature plays a crucial role in escalating tensions throughout the cosmic system by deliberately misrepresenting the communications it carries, adding insults and provocations that increase hostility between the tree's guardians. Ratatoska's mischievous nature reflects the inherent instability within the cosmic order, where even the mechanisms designed to maintain communication and balance contain elements that work toward ultimate destruction. The 9 realms suspended within Yggdrasil's branches represent distinct cosmic environments, each governed by different natural laws and inhabited by unique forms of life. Asgard occupies the highest position in this hierarchy, situated in the tree's crown where divine light shines most brightly. This realm appears as a vast plateau of gleaming metal and precious stones, its surface broken by magnificent halls, training grounds, and fortifications that house the Aesir gods and their chosen warriors. The architecture of Asgard reflects both divine perfection and military necessity. Gladsheim, Odin's primary hall, stretches for miles beneath a roof supported by golden pillars, its interior lit by weapons whose blades burn with eternal flames. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, accommodates 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through simultaneously. The building's walls consist of interlocked shields, while spears form its rafters, creating a structure that embodies the martial values central to Norse divine culture. Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, connects Asgard to the other realms through a span of crystallized light that shifts through every colour visible to divine perception. The bridge's surface feels solid beneath the feet of gods and worthy mortals, yet its translucent structure allows observers to see through to the realms below. Heimdall guards the bridge's Asgard terminus from his hall Himinbjorg, his enhanced senses capable of detecting threats from across all 9 realms. The bridge itself serves as both pathway and weapon, as its destruction during Ragnarok will sever the gods' primary means of coordinating their defence against the forces of chaos. Midgard occupies a central position within Yggdrasil's structure, suspended in the middle branches where it receives moderate amounts of divine light and influence. This realm appears as a vast disk of land surrounded by an enormous ocean, its edges protected by an impenetrable wall, constructed from the eyebrows of the primordial giant Ymir. The landscape varies dramatically across its expanse, encompassing frozen tundra, dense forests, fertile plains, and towering mountain ranges that provide diverse environments for human civilization to develop. The ocean surrounding Midgard serves as both boundary and threat, its depths inhabited by Jormungandr, the world serpent whose massive coils encircle the entire realm. This creature's presence creates a constant state of tension, as its movements generate tidal waves, storms, and seismic activity that periodically devastate human settlements. The serpent's venomous breath creates toxic clouds that drift across the ocean's surface, making sea travel dangerous even for the most skilled navigators. Jotunheim stretches across the outer branches of Yggdrasil, its landscape characterized by extreme geological formations and chaotic weather patterns that reflect the untamed nature of its giant inhabitants. Massive stone fortresses rise from jagged mountain peaks, their crude construction contrasting sharply with the refined architecture of Asgard. These structures appear built for siege warfare, with thick walls, narrow windows, and defensive positions that suggest constant preparation for conflict with the gods. The giants who dwell in Jotunheim display tremendous variation in size, appearance, and elemental affiliation. Frost giants inhabit the realm's northern regions, their bodies composed of living ice that constantly regenerates even when damaged. Mountain giants dwell in the central peaks, their stone-like flesh making them nearly impervious to conventional weapons. Fire giants occupy the southern territories bordering Muspelheim, their bodies wreathed in flames that never consume them but incinerate anything they touch. Alfheim floats among Yggdrasil's upper branches, its ethereal landscape composed of crystallized light and solidified music that creates structures of impossible beauty and complexity. The light elves who inhabit this realm appear as luminous humanoid figures whose bodies emit a soft radiance that illuminates their surroundings without creating harsh shadows. Their cities consist of spires and bridges that seem to grow naturally from concentrated beams of sunlight, creating architecture that shifts and flows according to the movements of celestial bodies. The elves' mastery of light-based magic allows them to create weapons and tools from concentrated radiance, forming swords that cut through darkness itself and shields that deflect both physical attacks and malevolent spells. Their knowledge of cosmic harmonies enables them to influence events across multiple realms simultaneously, though their interventions typically remain subtle and indirect rather than involving direct confrontation. Vanaheim occupies a position parallel to Asgard but separated by vast distances within Yggdrasil's branching structure. This realm appears as an endless series of fertile valleys and gentle hills covered in vegetation that changes with the seasons in patterns more complex and beautiful than those found in Midgard. The Vanir gods who dwell here focus their divine powers on fertility, prosperity, and the peaceful aspects of natural cycles, creating an environment where abundance flows naturally without requiring constant struggle or conflict. The halls of Vanaheim feature organic architecture that incorporates living trees and flowing water into their design, creating structures that breathe and grow with the passage of time. Gardens and orchards surround every building, their produce providing sustenance that never diminishes regardless of how much is consumed. The Vanir's mastery of fertility magic ensures that their realm remains productive and beautiful, even as other parts of the cosmic order begin to show signs of decay. Nidavellir, also known as Svartalfheim, exists within the roots and lower trunk of Yggdrasil, its caverns and tunnels extending deep into the World Tree's wooden flesh. The dark elves or dwarves who inhabit this realm have carved an intricate network of workshops, forges and halls from the living wood, creating spaces that pulse with the tree's own life force. The walls of these chambers display a natural grain pattern that shifts and swirls according to the cosmic currents flowing through the tree's heartwood. The craftsmanship produced in Nidavellir surpasses anything created in the other realms, as the dwarfs have learned to incorporate fragments of Yggdrasil's essence into their metalwork and stonework. Their forges burn with fires that draw heat directly from the tree's core, allowing them to work with materials and achieve temperatures impossible elsewhere. The weapons, jewelry, and magical artifacts they create often possess consciousness and will of their own, becoming active participants in the events that shape cosmic history. Muspelheim blazes at the southern edge of Yggdrasil's root system, its landscape consisting entirely of molten rock, flowing lava, and flames that burn without fuel. This realm existed before the world tree's growth, representing the primordial fire that will ultimately consume all creation during Ragnarok. The fire giants who inhabit Muspelheim appear as humanoid figures composed of living flame, their bodies constantly shifting between solid and gaseous states while maintaining coherent consciousness and purpose. Surtur, the ruler of Muspelheim, wields a sword that burns brighter than the sun itself, its blade capable of cutting through any material in existence, including the wood of Yggdrasil. His fortress rises from a lake of molten metal, its walls radiating heat that can be felt across multiple realms when the cosmic winds blow in the right direction. The realm's borders remain sealed by divine decree until the final battle, but the pressure of contained destruction continues to build as Ragnarok approaches. Helheim stretches beneath Yggdrasil's roots in the cold depths of Niflheim, its landscape shrouded in perpetual mist and darkness that obscures the boundaries between different regions. The goddess Hel rules this realm from her hall Eljudnir, her appearance reflecting the dual nature of death itself, half living flesh and half decaying corpse. The hall's walls consist of woven serpents whose venom drips continuously, creating pools of toxic liquid that serve as both decoration and defense against unwelcome visitors. The dead who arrive in Helheim undergo sorting based on the manner of their death and the lives they led while breathing. Those who died of disease or old age populate vast grey plains where they continue a shadowy existence that mirrors their mortal lives. Warriors who died in glorious deaths dwell in separate regions where they train eternally for battles they will never fight, the most wicked dead face punishments that reflect their crimes, though these torments lack the creative cruelty found in Christian depictions of hell. Niflheim itself predates the other realms, existing as the primordial source of cold, mist, and the waters that flow throughout the cosmic system. Its landscape consists of endless ice fields, broken by geysers of freezing vapour that rise from deep springs. The realm's most significant feature is Hvergelmir, the spring that feeds all cold rivers and streams across the 9 realms. This massive pool of primordial water bubbles constantly with energies that predate creation itself, making it a source of both life and destruction. The wells of Urd, Mimir and Hvergelmir represent focal points where cosmic forces concentrate and interact, creating nexuses of power that influence events across all 9 realms. The Well of Urd sits beneath Yggdrasil's root in Asgard, its waters reflecting not current reality, but the threads of fate as they weave through past, present, and future. The 3 Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, tend this well while spinning the destinies of all living beings. The Norns appear as women of indeterminate age, whose forms shift constantly between youth, maturity, and extreme old age depending on which temporal aspect they are manifesting at any given moment. Their spinning wheels create threads of fate from materials that include human hair, divine essence, giant blood, and fragments of Yggdrasil's wood. These threads form patterns of incredible complexity that determine not only individual destinies but the overarching narrative of cosmic history leading inevitably toward Ragnarok. The Well of Mimir contains the concentrated wisdom of ages, its depths holding knowledge of events that have not yet occurred, and secrets that could prevent or accelerate the coming destruction. Mimir's severed head floats in these waters, its eyes still bright with intelligence despite its separation from its body. The head speaks only to those who offer appropriate payment, typically demanding sacrifices that test the seeker's commitment to gaining knowledge regardless of personal cost. Odin's sacrifice of his eye to drink from Mimir's well established the precedent that wisdom requires genuine sacrifice, not mere payment. The knowledge gained from these waters comes with the burden of understanding fate's inexorable progression toward destruction, making those who drink from the well both more powerful and more tormented than before. The well's waters also preserve memories of previous cosmic cycles, containing information about worlds that existed before the current creation and hints about what might emerge after Ragnarok's conclusion. Vergelmir bubbles with the primordial chaos that preceded organised creation, its waters containing the potential for both generation and destruction in equal measure. The spring feeds rivers that flow throughout the Nine Realms, carrying with them traces of this original chaos that gradually weaken the cosmic order's stability. As Ragnarok approaches, the spring's activity increases, sending more chaotic energy through the water systems that connect all realms and accelerating the breakdown of natural laws that maintain cosmic balance. The delicate equilibrium maintaining cosmic stability depends on the continued interaction between these three wells and their connection through Yggdrasil's root system. The world tree serves as both conduit and filter, channeling the well's energies throughout the Nine Realms, while preventing any single force from overwhelming the others. However, this system contains inherent instabilities that grow more pronounced over time as the dragon Nidhogger's gnawing weakens the tree's ability to regulate cosmic forces effectively. The cosmic machinery that governs existence operates through the deliberate actions of three ancient beings whose authority supersedes even that of the gods themselves: Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, the Norns who dwell beside the Well of Urd beneath Yggdrasil's primary root, weave the threads of destiny with methodical precision, their work determining not only the fate of individual mortals, but the inexorable progression toward cosmic destruction that defines the Ragnarok narrative. These three sisters embody temporal forces that transcend conventional understanding of past, present, and future. Urd, whose name derives from the Old Norse word for fate, or that which was, appears as an elderly woman whose weathered hands move with the accumulated wisdom of countless eons. Her eyes reflect depths of memory that contain every significant event since creation's beginning, while her voice carries the weight of immutable decisions already made. When she speaks of past events, her words reshape reality itself, as her authority over completed actions allows her to determine which interpretations of history become cosmically true. Verdandi manifests as a woman in the prime of life, her appearance constantly shifting to reflect the dynamic nature of present circumstances. Her hands work the spinning wheel with urgent energy, pulling threads from the cosmic loom while simultaneously feeding new material into the pattern. Unlike her sisters, Verdandi's awareness remains focused on immediate concerns, her consciousness fully engaged with the complexities of current events as they unfold across the Nine Realms. Her decisions carry immediate consequences, as she determines which possibilities inherent in any given moment will manifest as actual reality. Skuld presents the most unsettling appearance among the three, her form flickering between youth and extreme old age as different potential futures compete for dominance. Her name means that which shall be or debt, reflecting her dual role as both prophet of coming events and collector of obligations that must eventually be paid. Her portion of the cosmic loom displays patterns that extend far beyond the current moment, showing threads that connect present actions to their ultimate consequences in ways that often span generations or even cosmic ages. The physical act of weaving performed by the Norns involves materials that defy conventional understanding of textile production. They spin threads from human hair voluntarily offered by mortals seeking to influence their destinies, though such offerings rarely produce the desired results. Divine essence extracted from the gods themselves forms stronger threads that resist breaking under stress, while giant blood provides the dark strands that represent conflict, destruction, and chaos. Most significantly, they incorporate fragments of Yggdrasil's wood into their weaving, creating threads that connect individual fates to the cosmic framework itself. Their loom stretches across dimensions, its frame constructed from crystallized time that allows the Norns to work simultaneously across multiple temporal perspectives. The warp threads run from the moment of creation to the final destruction of the current cosmic cycle, while the weft threads represent individual lives and actions that intersect with these larger patterns. The resulting tapestry displays a complexity that overwhelms mortal comprehension, showing how every decision made by any conscious being influences the overall trajectory toward Ragnarok. The Well of Erd itself serves as both workspace and source of power for the Norns' activities. Its waters appear crystal clear when viewed from the surface, but deeper examination reveals swirling currents of liquid fate that carry fragments of destiny between different temporal states. The well's bottom remains invisible even to divine sight, suggesting depths that extend beyond physical measurement into metaphysical dimensions where time and space lose their conventional meanings. Each day the Norns draw water from this well to sprinkle on Yggdrasil's roots, maintaining the world tree's health while simultaneously feeding it the concentrated essence of fate that flows through all existence. This daily ritual prevents the tree from withering under the constant assault of forces that seek to destroy the cosmic order, though the Norns' ministrations cannot halt the gradual weakening that makes Ragnarok inevitable. Their care preserves the tree's life just long enough for the predetermined sequence of events to unfold according to the pattern they have woven. The Volva tradition represents the mortal echo of the Norns' prophetic authority, creating a class of female seers whose visions provide glimpses into the cosmic tapestry's design. These women, known throughout Scandinavia for their ability to perceive hidden truths and future events, practice cedar magic that allowed them to enter trance states where normal temporal boundaries dissolved. Archaeological evidence from across the Nordic world reveals graves of volur containing distinctive staffs, amulets, and ritual implements that mark their special status within their communities. The Volva's staff, typically crafted from ashwood with iron or bronze fittings, served as both walking stick and magical implement. Its design often incorporated symbols associated with cosmic forces, spirals representing the flow of time, animal figures embodying different aspects of fate, and runic inscriptions that focus the seer's prophetic abilities. The staff's iron components created a connection to the underground realm where metals form, allowing the Volva to draw power from the Earth's depths, while the ashwood linked her to Yggdrasil itself. Ritual practices associated with Volva prophecy involved elaborate ceremonies that recreated cosmic conditions on a smaller scale. The seer would position herself at the centre of a circle formed by participants who provided both protection and spiritual energy for her trance work. Drums, chanting, and rhythmic movement helped induce the altered consciousness necessary for prophetic vision, while offerings of food, drink, and valuable objects provided payment for the knowledge she would reveal. The Völuspá preserves the most detailed example of Volva prophecy, presenting the entire Ragnarok sequence through the voice of an unnamed seeress who recounts her vision to Odin himself. The poem's structure follows the classical pattern of prophetic revelation, beginning with the seer's credentials and the circumstances of her summoning, then proceeding through a systematic description of cosmic history, from creation to destruction and eventual renewal. The Volva's account begins with her own origins, describing how she remembers the time before creation when nothing existed except the primordial void called Ginnunga Gap. Her memory encompasses the emergence of the first beings from the interaction between fire and ice, the creation of the world from the giant Ymir's corpse, and the establishment of the cosmic order that would eventually face destruction. This comprehensive temporal perspective establishes her authority to speak about future events with the same certainty she demonstrates regarding the past. Her description of Ragnarok's approach focuses on moral and social decay that precedes physical destruction. The Volva describes an age when kinship bonds dissolve, oaths lose their binding power, and violence becomes the primary means of resolving disputes. Brothers will fight against brothers, fathers will kill their sons, and the fundamental structures that maintain civilized society will collapse under the weight of accumulated betrayals and broken promises. The prophetic vision includes specific details about environmental changes that herald the coming catastrophe. Winters will grow longer and more severe, with 3 consecutive years of snow and ice that never fully melt. The sun and moon will lose their brightness as wolves devour them, plunging the world into darkness that makes navigation impossible, and crops fail across all inhabited lands. Earthquakes will shake the foundations of mountains, causing avalanches that bury entire settlements and opening chasms that swallow rivers and lakes. Other Eddic sources expand upon the Völuspá's revelations while providing alternative perspectives on the same prophetic material. The Vafthrudnismal presents Ragnarok prophecy through a wisdom contest between Odin and the giant Vafthrudnir, where each participant demonstrates knowledge by correctly answering increasingly difficult questions about cosmic secrets. This format allows for more detailed exploration of specific aspects of the end times, as each question focuses on particular elements of the destruction sequence. The giant's responses reveal knowledge that rivals Odin's own understanding, suggesting that awareness of Ragnarok extends beyond the divine realm into the consciousness of beings typically portrayed as enemies of cosmic order. Vafthrudnir's descriptions of the final battle include tactical details about troop movements, weapon capabilities, and battlefield geography that complement the Völuspá's more atmospheric account of social and environmental collapse. Skaldic poetry from the 9th through 12th centuries preserves fragmentary references to Ragnarok themes in contexts that suggest widespread familiarity with the prophetic tradition among educated audiences. Court poets serving Norwegian and Danish kings incorporated allusions to the twilight of the gods into praise poems and historical narratives, using kennings and metaphors that assumed listeners would recognize the references. These scattered allusions demonstrate how Ragnarok imagery permeated medieval Scandinavian culture beyond its preservation in formal mythological texts. The Eriksmal and Hakonarmal, poems commemorating the deaths of Norwegian kings, employ Ragnarok symbolism to frame royal mortality within cosmic contexts. These works describe deceased rulers joining the Einherjar in Valhalla, while simultaneously suggesting that their deaths represent steps toward the final battle that will determine the fate of gods and mortals alike. The poet's use of eschatological imagery transforms individual historical events into components of the larger prophetic narrative. Runic inscriptions from across Scandinavia provide additional evidence of prophetic traditions that parallel the literary sources while revealing regional variations in eschatological belief. The rockstone's cryptic references to cosmic destruction employ vocabulary and imagery that connects to Ragnarok themes, while maintaining the ambiguous character typical of runic texts. The stone's mention of the destruction of the sanctuary and allusions to supernatural battles suggest that runic literacy included familiarity with apocalyptic narratives. The concept of predetermined fate that underlies all prophetic traditions in Norse culture creates a fundamental tension between divine omniscience and meaningful action. If the Norns have already woven the threads of destiny that lead inevitably to Ragnarok, the question arises whether gods and mortals possess genuine freedom to influence events or merely play out roles assigned to them by cosmic necessity. This theological problem appears throughout the source material without reaching definitive resolution, as different texts emphasize either fatalistic acceptance or heroic resistance to predetermined doom. Odin's relentless quest for knowledge about Ragnarok demonstrates both awareness of fate's inevitability and determination to find ways of averting or surviving the coming destruction. His sacrifices to gain wisdom, hanging himself from Yggdrasil, trading his eye for a drink from Mimir's well, learning the secrets of Sita magic from Freya, represent attempts to accumulate enough knowledge to change destiny's course. Yet the information he gains consistently confirms rather than contradicts the prophetic visions, suggesting that knowledge itself cannot alter fate's fundamental patterns. The gods' preparation for the final battle reflects similar ambivalence about fate and free will. Their training of the Einherjar in Valhalla, construction of defensive fortifications in Asgard, and attempts to bind potentially dangerous beings like Loki and Fenrir demonstrate active resistance to their predicted doom. However, these same preparations often contribute to the very conditions that make Ragnarok inevitable, as their precautions create the resentments and conflicts that fuel the final catastrophe. The binding of Fenrir provides the clearest example of this paradox. The god's knowledge that the wolf will eventually devour Odin during Ragnarok motivates their decision to restrain him using the magical chain Gleipnir. However, the betrayal of the trust Fenrir showed by placing his paw in Tyr's mouth as surety creates the hatred that ensures he will indeed seek revenge against his captors. The prophetic knowledge that was meant to prevent disaster instead causes the very attitudes that make the prophecy's fulfillment certain. Human responses to prophetic knowledge display similar complexity, as mortals must navigate between acceptance of cosmic fate and responsibility for their individual choices. The Volva tradition itself embodies this tension, as seers who can perceive future events continue to offer their services to clients seeking to influence outcomes that prophecy suggests are already determined. The practice of seeking prophetic guidance would be meaningless if fate were completely fixed, yet the consistent accuracy of Volva predictions suggests that major events follow predetermined patterns regardless of human intervention. The preservation of prophetic traditions during the conversion period reveals how eschatological knowledge adapted to changing religious contexts while maintaining its essential character. Christian missionaries encountered well-established beliefs about cosmic destruction and renewal that paralleled their own apocalyptic teachings, creating opportunities for syncretism that allowed traditional knowledge to survive within new theological frameworks. The result was a complex blend of pagan and Christian eschatology that influenced both popular belief and learned speculation throughout medieval Scandinavia. The transformation of Loki from valued ally to cosmic enemy represents one of the most psychologically complex developments in Norse mythology, marking a fundamental shift in the divine order that accelerates the approach of Ragnarok. Initially, Loki served as Odin's blood brother and trusted companion, his cunning intelligence and shape-shifting abilities proving invaluable in resolving crises that threatened Asgard's stability. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia reveals artifacts depicting Loki in positive contexts well into the 10th century, suggesting his role as a beneficial trickster persisted in popular consciousness long after literary sources began emphasizing his destructive aspects. Loki's physical appearance defied easy categorization, reflecting his liminal nature as a being who existed between established cosmic boundaries. Contemporary descriptions portray him as tall and lean, with sharp, angular features that could shift subtly depending on his emotional state or intentions. His eyes displayed an unsettling quality of constant movement, never quite focusing on a single point for extended periods, while his smile carried implications of hidden knowledge that others might find uncomfortable to contemplate. His hair appeared red in some contexts and black in others, changing according to lighting conditions in ways that suggested supernatural rather than natural causes. His clothing typically consisted of well-crafted garments that emphasized mobility and concealment rather than displaying wealth or status. Dark leather boots allowed him to move silently across various terrain types, while his cloak incorporated subtle patterns that helped him blend into shadows or crowds when circumstances required discretion. He carried few weapons openly, preferring to rely on wit and magic rather than brute force, though he possessed several enchanted items obtained through various schemes and bargains with supernatural beings. The gradual deterioration of Loki's relationship with the Aesir began with seemingly minor incidents that accumulated over time into a pattern of increasing hostility and mistrust. His pranks, initially harmless expressions of his trickster nature, grew more elaborate and potentially dangerous as he sought to maintain his position within divine society through increasingly dramatic demonstrations of his abilities. The theft of Sif's golden hair, while ultimately resolved through his procurement of even more magnificent replacement locks from the Dark Elves, established a precedent for actions that created serious problems before providing solutions. His involvement in the construction of Asgard's wall demonstrated both his value as a problem solver and the dangerous unpredictability that would eventually make him a liability. When the unnamed giant mason offered to build impregnable fortifications around the divine realm in exchange for the sun, moon, and Freya as payment, the gods agreed to terms they never intended to honour. Loki's suggestion to accept the contract while secretly sabotaging the work seemed clever at the time, but his transformation into a mare to distract the giant stallion, Svadilfari, resulted in consequences no one anticipated. The eight-legged horse Sleipnir, born from Loki's union with Svadilfari, became Odin's mount and one of the most powerful supernatural beings in existence. However, the circumstances of Sleipnir's conception created an uncomfortable reminder of Loki's willingness to sacrifice his own dignity and undergo physical transformation to achieve desired outcomes. The incident also demonstrated his capacity for deception that extended beyond mere pranks into fundamental violations of trust and natural order. The birth of Loki's three monstrous children with the giantess Angrboda marked the beginning of direct threats to cosmic stability that could be traced to his actions. These offspring, Jormungandr the world serpent, Fenrir the wolf, and Hel the goddess of the dead, embodied different aspects of destruction that would play crucial roles in Ragnarok's unfolding. The gods' knowledge of prophecies concerning these beings created a dilemma about how to respond to threats that had not yet manifested but were predicted to cause enormous damage in the future. Jormungandr grew with supernatural speed from his birth, his serpentine form expanding rapidly beyond any containment the gods could devise. His scales appeared dark green with bronze highlights that shifted according to his emotional state, while his eyes glowed with an inner fire that suggested intelligence far beyond that of ordinary reptiles. Venom dripped constantly from his fangs, creating pools of toxic liquid that killed vegetation and corroded metal wherever it touched. The god's decision to cast him into the ocean surrounding Midgard seemed like a reasonable solution to an immediate problem, but the serpent continued growing until his coils encircled the entire realm. The world serpent's presence in Midgard's ocean created ongoing threats to human civilization through the storms and tidal waves generated by his movements. Sailors reported encounters with portions of his body that they initially mistook for islands, only discovering their error when the land began moving beneath their feet. His breathing created underwater currents that could drag ships off course or into dangerous waters, while his periodic surfacing generated whirlpools capable of swallowing entire fleets. Fenrir presented a more complex challenge because his initial behaviour showed none of the hostility that prophecy predicted would eventually characterise his relationship with the gods. As a young wolf, he displayed remarkable intelligence and even affection toward his divine captors, allowing Tyr to feed him by hand and playing games with other residents of Asgard. His rapid growth soon made such interactions impossible, as his size increased daily until he stood taller than a horse and possessed jaws capable of crushing stone. The wolf's appearance inspired both admiration and fear among those who encountered him. His fur appeared grey-black with silver highlights that caught light in ways that emphasized the powerful muscles beneath. His eyes held an unsettling intelligence that seemed to evaluate everything around him with predatory calculation, while his movements combined grace and power in ways that suggested he could explode into violent action at any moment. His howls carried across vast distances, their haunting quality affecting the behaviour of ordinary wolves throughout all 9 realms. The gods' growing unease about Fenrir's presence in Asgard led to increasingly elaborate attempts to test his strength through challenges presented as games. They commissioned chains of ever-increasing strength, claiming they wanted to see if the wolf could break them as demonstrations of his impressive power. Fenrir's willingness to participate in these tests gradually diminished as he began to suspect their true purpose. his intelligence allowing him to recognize the transition from play to imprisonment. The creation of Gleipnir required the combined efforts of the most skilled craftsmen in Nidavellir, who forged a chain from materials that existed outside normal physical laws. The Dark Elves incorporated the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird into a binding that appeared as thin as silk thread, but possessed strength that could restrain any physical force. The chain's paradoxical nature, composed of things that did not exist in conventional reality, made it capable of holding beings whose power transcended normal limitations. Fenrir's demand that one of the gods place a hand in his mouth as surety while they applied Gleipnir demonstrated his awareness that this test differed fundamentally from previous challenges. Tyr's willingness to make this sacrifice reflected both his courage and his understanding that the wolf's continued freedom posed unacceptable risks to cosmic stability. The moment when Fenrir realized he could not break the chain and bit off Tyr's hand marked the transformation of a potentially loyal ally into an implacable enemy whose hatred would fuel his participation in Ragnarok. The bound wolf's location beneath the earth in a cavern sealed with massive stone slabs created ongoing problems that affected the cosmic order's stability. His struggles against Gleipnir generated earthquakes that shook the foundations of mountains and caused avalanches that buried human settlements. His howls of rage and frustration carried through underground passages, emerging from caves and crevices across Midgard as sounds that terrified both humans and animals. Most significantly, his constant efforts to escape gradually weakened the magical bonds that held him, making his eventual freedom during Ragnarok inevitable rather than merely possible. Hel's appearance reflected her dual nature as both living goddess and ruler of the dead, with half her body displaying the beauty and vitality of divine youth, while the other half showed the decay and corruption associated with death itself. Her living side possessed pale but healthy flesh, bright eyes and flowing hair that moved with supernatural grace, while her dead side revealed exposed bone, rotting flesh, and empty eye sockets that glowed with cold fire. This striking visual contrast made her simultaneously attractive and repulsive, embodying the complex relationship between life and death that characterized her divine portfolio. The gods' decision to grant Hel dominion over those who died of disease or old age reflected their attempt to find constructive uses for Loki's dangerous offspring while limiting their potential for causing harm. Her realm in the depths of Helheim provided necessary services for cosmic order by processing the souls of the dead and maintaining the boundary between life and death. However, her resentment at being exiled from Asgard and forced to dwell in the cold, misty depths created another source of hostility that would influence her decisions during Ragnarok. The death of Balder marked the definitive transformation of Loki from problematic ally to active enemy of the gods, as his role in orchestrating the beloved god's destruction crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Balder's prophetic dreams of his own death had prompted Frigg to exact oaths from all things in creation to never harm her son, creating what appeared to be perfect protection against any possible threat. The gods' subsequent game of throwing objects at the now invulnerable Balder reflected their relief and joy at having found a way to protect their most beloved member. Loki's discovery that mistletoe had been overlooked in Frigg's oath-taking demonstrated his continued ability to find weaknesses in seemingly perfect plans. His crafting of a dart from mistletoe wood and his guidance of the blind god Hodda's hand to throw it represented premeditated murder rather than accidental death, as he deliberately exploited the only vulnerability in Balder's protection. The dart's penetration of Balder's chest and his immediate clap shocked the assembled gods into stunned silence, as they witnessed the destruction of their most perfect member through treachery they had not anticipated. The gods' immediate pursuit of Loki following Balder's death reflected their understanding that this act represented a fundamental change in their relationship with the trickster. His shape-shifting abilities allowed him to evade capture temporarily by transforming into various animal forms, but his eventual discovery hiding in the form of a salmon in a waterfall demonstrated that even his considerable powers could not indefinitely protect him from divine justice. The construction of the net that trapped him, ironically based on his own design, showed how his cleverness could be turned against him by those who understood his methods. The binding of Loki beneath the earth created a punishment that matched the severity of his crime while ensuring his suffering would continue until Ragnarok's arrival. The gods positioned him on 3 stone slabs, using the entrails of his own son Nafi to bind him in place, after transforming his other son Vali into a wolf who killed his brother. This use of his children's remains as instruments of punishment added psychological torment to physical restraint, ensuring that his hatred would deepen rather than diminish over time. The placement of a venomous serpent above Loki's head created ongoing torture that would continue throughout his imprisonment. The snake's venom dripped constantly onto his face, causing excruciating pain that made his entire body convulse with such violence that the resulting earthquakes affected the stability of mountains and caused landslides across Midgard. His wife Sigin's loyal vigil, holding a bowl to catch the venom and providing temporary relief when she emptied it, demonstrated both marital devotion and the limited nature of any comfort available to the bound god. Sigin's appearance reflected the dignity and sorrow of a divine being trapped in circumstances beyond her control. Her long hair, originally golden, had turned white from the stress of her endless vigil, while her face showed the strain of maintaining hope despite the hopelessness of her situation. Her clothing, once fine garments appropriate to her status as a goddess, had become simple, practical garments suitable for her underground existence. Her hands, constantly holding the bowl that caught her husband's torment, had developed calluses and scars that mark the physical cost of her loyalty. The psychological dynamics of Loki's imprisonment created conditions that ensured his eventual escape would be motivated by maximum hatred and desire for revenge. His isolation from divine society, combined with constant physical pain and the knowledge that his children had been killed or exiled, transformed whatever remaining loyalty he might have felt into pure antagonism toward the gods who had betrayed him. The periodic intervals when Sigyn emptied the bowl and venom struck his face directly served as regular reminders of his helplessness and the gods' power over him. The escalating conflicts between the Aesir and the giants during this period reflected the breakdown of diplomatic relationships that had previously maintained relative stability between the two groups. The giants' awareness of Loki's binding and the god's treatment of his children created resentment that spread throughout Jotunheim, as many giants viewed these actions as violations of hospitality laws and kinship obligations that governed interactions between different groups of supernatural beings. The giants' military preparations during this period involved the construction of new fortifications and the forging of weapons specifically designed to be effective against divine opponents. Their craftsmen developed techniques for working with materials that could harm gods, including iron weapons blessed with curses and armour that could deflect divine magic. The recruitment of allies from among other enemies of the gods, including dark elves dissatisfied with their treatment by Asgard and various monsters seeking revenge for past injuries, created a coalition that posed genuine threats to divine supremacy. The gods' response to these growing threats involved their own military preparations, including the expansion of Valhalla to accommodate more Einherjar and the development of new weapons and tactics for the anticipated final battle. However, their actions also included diplomatic efforts that proved increasingly unsuccessful as trust between the different groups continued to deteriorate. The failure of these negotiations reflected the fundamental incompatibility between divine order and chaotic forces that had been temporarily suppressed but never truly resolved. The birth of additional monstrous offspring during this period created new threats that compounded existing problems. Various giants produced children whose supernatural abilities posed specific challenges to cosmic stability, while other supernatural beings aligned themselves with forces opposing divine rule. The proliferation of these threats reflected the cosmic order's increasing instability as the bonds maintaining peace between different groups weakened under the pressure of accumulated grievances and broken agreements. The environmental changes that accompanied these social and political developments included alterations in weather patterns, the behaviour of animals, and the fertility of agricultural lands that suggested fundamental disruptions in natural processes. Winters grew longer and more severe, while summers became shorter and less productive, creating conditions that stressed human populations and made them more susceptible to conflicts over scarce resources. These changes reflected the cosmic order's deterioration as the forces maintaining stability gradually weakened under the pressure of accumulated tensions and unresolved conflicts. The cosmic order's deterioration manifested most dramatically through the prophetic dreams that began plaguing Balder, the most beloved of the Aesir, whose radiant presence had long served as a symbol of divine perfection and cosmic stability. These visions arrived with increasing frequency and intensity, depicting his own death through imagery so vivid and disturbing that they disrupted his sleep and cast shadows across his normally luminous demeanour. The dreams consistently featured darkness overwhelming light, with Balder witnessing his own destruction from multiple perspectives, sometimes as victim, sometimes as observer, but always with the certainty that his death was both inevitable and imminent. Archaeological evidence from 9th and 10th century Scandinavian burial sites reveals artifacts associated with Balder worship that underwent significant changes during this period, with earlier representations showing him in triumphant poses gradually giving way to more sombre depictions that emphasized his vulnerability. Silver amulets from Denmark and Sweden display increasingly complex iconography that appears to reference prophetic visions, including recurring motifs of light being extinguished and protective barriers being breached by unexpected threats. Balder's physical appearance embodied the divine perfection that made his prophetic dreams so disturbing to witness. His skin possessed a luminescence that seemed to emanate from within, creating a soft radiance that illuminated his surroundings without casting harsh shadows. His hair appeared as spun gold that caught and reflected light in ways that emphasized his otherworldly nature, while his eyes held depths of blue that reminded observers of clear summer skies or deep mountain lakes. His movements carried an inherent grace that made even simple gestures appear choreographed, while his voice possessed qualities that could calm agitated listeners or inspire courage in those facing difficult challenges. The god's clothing typically consisted of white and gold garments that complemented his natural radiance while emphasizing his role as a being of pure light and goodness. His tunics incorporated intricate embroidery that depicted scenes of natural harmony, flowering meadows, peaceful animals, and abundant harvests that reflected his association with beauty and positive growth. His belt bore a golden buckle crafted by the dark elves that could focus his inner light into concentrated beams, capable of dispelling magical darkness or revealing hidden truths. Frigg's response to her son's disturbing visions demonstrated both maternal devotion and divine authority as she embarked on an unprecedented campaign to secure oaths from every entity in creation. The goddess travelled throughout the 9 realms, visiting locations both magnificent and humble to extract promises that nothing would cause harm to her beloved son. Her journey took her from the highest peaks of Asgard to the deepest caverns of Nidavellir, from the burning plains of Muspelheim to the frozen wastes of Niflheim. Her appearance during these travels reflected the urgency of her mission, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her status as Queen of the Gods. Her long hair, typically worn in elaborate braids adorned with golden ornaments, was arranged in simpler styles that allowed for rapid movement between realms. Her clothing consisted of practical garments in rich blues and silvers that could withstand the environmental extremes she encountered while still displaying her divine nature. She carried a staff topped with a crystal that glowed with soft light, serving both as a walking aid during difficult terrain and as a focus for the magical oaths she extracted. The process of oath-taking involved complex rituals that varied according to the nature of the entities from whom Frigg sought promises. When addressing the elements, fire, water, earth and air, she performed ceremonies that acknowledged their fundamental roles in cosmic order, while appealing to their investment in maintaining stability. Fire required offerings of precious oils and rare woods that burned with colours representing different aspects of Baldur's divine nature, while water demanded libations of mead and wine poured into sacred springs and rivers throughout the realms. Negotiations with living beings proved more complex, as each species possessed different concepts of obligation and different motivations for agreeing to supernatural compacts. The great predators, wolves, bears and eagles required demonstrations of respect for their hunting prowess and territorial rights before agreeing to forswear violence against Baldur. Domestic animals offered their oaths more readily, though horses demanded assurances that their cooperation would not limit their freedom to choose their own riders and destinations. Plants and trees presented unique challenges because their consciousness operated according to temporal scales vastly different from those of mobile beings. Ancient oaks and ash trees required extended negotiations that could span several days, as their decision-making processes incorporated considerations of seasonal cycles, soil conditions, and relationships with other forest inhabitants. Flowering plants proved more responsive to immediate appeals, though their oaths carried temporal limitations that corresponded to their natural life cycles. Metals and stones required the most elaborate ceremonial approaches, as their consciousness existed in forms barely comprehensible to organic beings. Iron demanded recognition of its role in warfare and craftsmanship, while gold sought acknowledgement of its beauty and incorruptible nature. Precious stones each possessed distinct personalities that required individual attention. Diamonds insisted on recognition of their hardness and clarity, while emeralds demanded appreciation for their connection to growing things. The universality of Frigg's success in obtaining these oaths created an unprecedented situation, where divine protection extended beyond conventional magical defences into a cosmic compact that bound all creation to Baldur's safety. The completion of her oath-taking journey marked the first time in cosmic history that a single being possessed absolute protection from harm, as every entity capable of causing damage had sworn to refrain from violence against him. The gods' celebration of this achievement involved elaborate festivities that demonstrated their relief at having found a way to circumvent fate's apparent decree of Baldur's doom. They organised contests and games that showcased their beloved member's new invulnerability, with various gods attempting to harm him using different weapons and methods while observers cheered his immunity to all attacks. Arrows bounced harmlessly from his skin, swords shattered against his flesh, and even magical weapons proved incapable of inflicting the slightest injury. These demonstrations gradually evolved into a regular entertainment, where gods would gather to test Baldur's protection, using increasingly creative methods. They hurled stones, shot arrows, struck with hammers, and even attempted to burn him with magical fires, all without producing any harmful effects. The games became a symbol of divine triumph over fate and a celebration of the power of maternal love and determination to protect the innocent. Loki's absence from these celebrations reflected his growing alienation from divine society and his resentment at being excluded from the joy surrounding Baldur's protection. His observations of the proceedings from concealed positions revealed both his continued ability to move undetected through Asgard and his increasing focus on finding weaknesses in apparently perfect defences. His shape-shifting abilities allowed him to assume forms that could approach the celebrations without arousing suspicion, gathering information about the exact nature of Baldur's protection and the methods being used to test it. The discovery of mistletoe's exemption from Frigg's oath-taking required both supernatural cunning and intimate knowledge of the goddess's methods and psychology. Loki's investigation began with careful questioning of various beings who had been approached during Frigg's journey, using his shape-shifting abilities to assume forms that would encourage honest responses without revealing his identity or intentions. His conversations with forest spirits, earth elementals, and plant consciousness revealed the comprehensive scope of the oath-taking, while also identifying potential gaps in coverage. Mistletoe's unique status as a plant that grows without touching the earth, drawing its sustenance from host trees rather than soil, created ambiguity about its classification within the categories of beings from whom Frigg had sought oaths. Its parasitic nature meant it existed in a liminal state between independent plant and extension of its host, while its association with winter solstice rituals gave it connections to temporal cycles that transcended normal botanical classifications. The plant's physical characteristics contributed to its oversight during Frigg's comprehensive campaign. Mistletoe's small size and tendency to grow high in tree branches made it easy to overlook during surveys of forest vegetation, while its pale green colour and waxy texture distinguished it from the more prominent plants that naturally attracted attention. Its berries, white and translucent with a pearl-like quality, contained concentrated essences that made them valuable for certain magical applications, while also making them potentially dangerous if properly prepared. Loki's approach to mistletoe required careful negotiation, because the plant's consciousness operated according to principles that differed significantly from those governing other vegetation. Its parasitic lifestyle had created a worldview focused on survival through adaptation and exploitation of opportunities, making it more receptive to proposals that offered mutual benefit rather than simple commands or requests. Its agreement to participate in Baldur's destruction reflected both its resentment at being ignored during Frigg's oath-taking and its curiosity about the consequences of breaking such a comprehensive protective compact. The crafting of the fatal projectile involved techniques that combined traditional woodworking with magical processes designed to concentrate the mistletoe's latent destructive potential. Loki shaped the wood using tools that had been blessed with curses, their edges sharpened not just physically but metaphysically to cut through supernatural protections as well as organic material. The dart's design incorporated aerodynamic principles that would ensure accurate flight, while also featuring ritual markings that focused hostile intent into concentrated form. The weapon's appearance reflected both its deadly purpose and its humble origins, measuring approximately the length of a man's forearm, with a shaft that tapered from thumb thickness at the grip to needle sharpness at the point. The wood retained its natural pale green colour but acquired a subtle luminescence that suggested supernatural enhancement, while the surface displayed grain patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally. The point had been hardened through exposure to magical fires that burned at temperatures capable of affecting divine flesh, creating a tip that could penetrate protections that would turn aside conventional weapons. Hodder's participation in the fatal throw reflected both his genuine affection for Balder and his exclusion from the games celebrating his brother's invulnerability. The blind god's inability to see the targets or judge distances had prevented him from participating in the contests that brought joy to other divine beings, creating a sense of isolation that made him particularly susceptible to Loki's manipulative suggestions. His enhanced hearing and tactile sensitivity, developed to compensate for his lack of sight, made him acutely aware of the laughter and celebration from which he was excluded. The blind god's physical appearance emphasized both his divine nature and his disability in ways that created a striking visual contrast. His build matched that of other Aesir, with the tall stature and powerful musculature that characterized divine beings, but his movements displayed the careful deliberation of someone navigating without visual cues. His eyes, clouded by the supernatural blindness that had affected him since birth, retained traces of their original blue colour while displaying the milky, opacity that marked his condition. His hands, strengthened and sensitized by years of relying on touch for information, possessed calluses and scars that told stories of learning to function in a world designed for sighted beings. Loki's approach to Hodder employed psychological manipulation techniques that exploited the blind god's desire for inclusion while concealing the true nature of the proposed activity. He presented the mistletoe dart as a harmless projectile that would allow Hodder to participate in honouring Balder alongside his fellow gods, emphasising the joy and satisfaction that would come from demonstrating his own skill at the popular game. His description of the weapon's properties focused on its lightness and balance rather than its lethal potential, while his guidance of Hodder's throwing motion was presented as assistance rather than direction toward a specific target. The moment of the throw unfolded with a terrible inevitability that reflected the cosmic forces converging to produce this predetermined outcome. Hodder's arm drew back with practiced motion, despite his inexperience with the specific weapon, his enhanced proprioception allowing him to gauge the dart's weight and balance through tactile feedback. Loki's guidance positioned both the thrower and the weapon with precision that ensured accurate aim despite the blind god's inability to see his target, while the assembled gods watched with the expectant amusement that had characterized all previous demonstrations of Balder's invulnerability. The mistletoe dart's flight traced a perfect arc through the air, its supernatural enhancement allowing it to maintain stability and accuracy despite its improvised construction. The weapon's passage created a subtle disturbance in the local magical fields that some of the more sensitive gods detected as a momentary unease, though none recognized the sensation as a warning of impending disaster. The dart's approach to Balder generated no alarm because previous projectiles had consistently bounced harmlessly away, creating an expectation of another demonstration of divine protection rather than anticipation of actual harm. The penetration of Balder's chest occurred with shocking suddenness that transformed celebration into horror within the span of a heartbeat. The mistletoe point, enhanced by Loki's malevolent craftsmanship, and empowered by its exemption from Frigg's protective oaths, pierced the god's radiant skin and sank deep into his heart with an ease that seemed impossible given the comprehensive protection surrounding him. The impact produced no dramatic sound or visual effect, simply the quiet whisper of wood entering flesh, and the immediate cessation of the light that had emanated from Balder's divine form. The beloved god's collapse sent shockwaves through the assembled deities that extended beyond mere emotional distress into physical and magical disruptions that affected the local environment. His body struck the ground with an impact that caused tremors in the earth beneath Asgard, while the extinguishing of his inner light created a darkness that spread outward from his fallen form like a wave of shadow consuming illumination. The silence that followed lasted only moments before erupting into cries of grief and rage that echoed across all 9 realms. Hermod's immediate volunteering for the journey to Helheim reflected both his courage and his unique qualifications for attempting to negotiate with the goddess of the dead. As Odin's son and one of the swiftest of the gods, he possessed both the divine authority necessary to demand audience with Hel and the physical capabilities required to survive the dangerous journey through the realms of the dead. His previous experience as Odin's messenger had familiarized him with the protocols and procedures necessary for conducting diplomatic missions under challenging circumstances. The preparation for Hermod's journey involved both practical considerations and ritual requirements that reflected the unprecedented nature of attempting to retrieve a god from death itself. Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged mount, was selected as the only steed capable of carrying a rider safely through the treacherous paths leading to Helheim, while maintaining the speed necessary to complete the journey before cosmic conditions changed. The horse's supernatural abilities included the capacity to gallop across air and water as easily as solid ground, while his enhanced endurance allowed him to maintain maximum speed for extended periods without rest. Hermod's equipment for the journey included weapons and protective items specifically chosen for their effectiveness in the realm of the dead. His sword, forged from metal that had been blessed by all the gods and tempered in fires that burned in multiple realms simultaneously, could cut through supernatural barriers and defend against attacks from undead beings. His armour incorporated protective runes that would shield him from the life-draining effects of prolonged exposure to death magic, while his cloak had been woven from threads that retained connections to the living world and would help him maintain his vital essence during his time in Helheim. The cosmic machinery that had maintained seasonal cycles since creation's beginning began showing signs of fundamental breakdown 3 years before Ragnarok's arrival, as natural processes that governed weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and celestial movements fell under the influence of supernatural forces that sought to destabilize the ordered world. This period, known as the Fimbul Winter, represented far more than merely harsh weather conditions. It constituted a systematic assault on the environmental foundations that supported life across all inhabited realms. The winter's onset arrived without the gradual temperature decline that typically marked seasonal transitions. Instead, temperatures plummeted within days to levels that exceeded the coldest conditions previously recorded in mortal memory, while winds began blowing from directions that defied established meteorological patterns. Snow fell continuously for weeks without interruption, accumulating to depths that buried entire settlements and made travel between communities impossible for all but the most determined individuals equipped with supernatural assistance. The snow itself displayed properties that distinguished it from ordinary precipitation, possessing a crystalline structure that reflected light in ways that created disorienting visual effects for anyone attempting to navigate through the storms. Each flake appeared perfectly symmetrical when examined closely, but their patterns incorporated geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The accumulated snow refused to melt even when exposed to fires that burned hot enough to work metal, while its weight exceeded that of normal snow by margins that caused structural failures in buildings designed to withstand typical winter conditions. Ice formation during the Fimbul Winter followed patterns that violated natural laws governing the freezing of water. Rivers froze solid from surface to bottom within hours of the temperature drop, trapping fish and other aquatic life in crystalline tombs that preserved their forms with perfect clarity. Lakes became skating surfaces of supernatural smoothness that reflected images with mirror-like perfection, while simultaneously displaying depths that seemed to extend far beyond their actual measurements. The ice produced sounds when walked upon, musical tones that varied according to the walker's weight and emotional state, creating harmonies that could be hauntingly beautiful or deeply unsettling depending on circumstances. Ocean freezing presented the most dramatic evidence of the winter's supernatural nature, as salt water that should have remained liquid at the prevailing temperatures formed ice sheets that extended far beyond any coastline previously affected by natural freezing. These frozen seas created bridges between islands and continents that had never been connected by land, allowing migration patterns for both animals and hostile beings that fundamentally altered the strategic situation across multiple realms. The ice's thickness varied unpredictably, with some areas supporting the weight of entire armies, while others concealed thin spots that could swallow unwary travellers without warning. Agricultural devastation followed immediately upon the winter's establishment, as crops that had been approaching harvest readiness froze in their fields before farmers could gather them. Grain stores that should have provided sustenance through normal winter months proved inadequate for the extended cold period, while hunting became increasingly difficult, as game animals either died from exposure or migrated to regions beyond human reach. Livestock required constant attention to prevent freezing, but the effort of maintaining animal warmth consumed fuel supplies that communities needed for their own survival. The psychological impact of perpetual winter created social stresses that compounded the practical challenges of surviving in the harsh conditions. Human communities that had functioned cooperatively during normal times began experiencing conflicts over scarce resources, as the prospect of indefinite cold weather made sharing seem less viable than hoarding. Traditional hospitality customs broke down as households became reluctant to shelter travellers who might consume precious fuel and food supplies, while the darkness created by constant cloud cover contributed to emotional states that made violence seem like reasonable solutions to disputes. Kinship bonds that had provided social stability for generations began dissolving under the pressure of survival concerns that pitted family members against each other in competition for limited resources. Brothers fought over inheritance rights that had previously been settled amicably, while parents faced impossible choices between feeding all their children inadequately or ensuring some survived by denying others. Marriage alliances that had been arranged to strengthen community ties became sources of conflict when different families possessed unequal access to stored supplies or fuel sources. Sacred oaths that had governed relationships between individuals and communities lost their binding power as people prioritized immediate survival over abstract obligations to honor agreements made under different circumstances. Warriors abandoned their lords when promised payments could not be delivered due to economic disruption, while merchants violated contracts when fulfilling them would have required travelling through conditions that posed unacceptable risks to life and property. The breakdown of oath-keeping created cascading effects throughout social networks, as each violation made others more likely to abandon their own commitments. Religious observances suffered similar disruption as communities found themselves unable to maintain ritual practices that required specific materials, locations, or timing that the winter conditions made impossible to provide. Temple fires that had burned continuously for decades were extinguished by storms that penetrated even the most carefully constructed buildings, while sacred groves became inaccessible due to snow accumulation that made travel to remote locations impossible. The inability to perform traditional ceremonies created spiritual anxiety that compounded the physical hardships of survival. Warfare increased dramatically during the Fimbul winter, as desperate communities resorted to raiding their neighbours for supplies that could not be obtained through normal trade or production. These conflicts differed from traditional seasonal raiding patterns because they involved entire populations fighting for resources necessary for basic survival, rather than warriors seeking glory or wealth through combat. The frozen conditions favoured defenders who could prepare adequate fortifications and stockpile supplies, while attackers faced the challenge of conducting military operations in weather that made conventional tactics ineffective. The development of new military techniques adapted to winter warfare conditions demonstrated human adaptability, while also revealing the extent to which normal social structures had broken down. Warriors learned to use ice and snow as building materials for temporary fortifications, while the frozen ground allowed the movement of heavy equipment that would have been impossible during normal weather conditions. However, these tactical innovations came at enormous cost in human life, as exposure-related casualties often exceeded battle deaths during conflicts conducted in the supernatural cold. Astronomical phenomena accompanying the Fimbul winter provided visible evidence that cosmic forces beyond terrestrial weather systems were involved in the environmental catastrophe. The sun's appearance changed dramatically, its normally bright golden disk becoming pale and wan, while displaying a corona of sickly green light that cast eerie illumination across the snow-covered landscape. The solar disk itself appeared smaller than normal, as if the sun were retreating to greater distances from the Earth, while its daily path across the sky became increasingly erratic. The wolves Skoll and Hati, whose eternal pursuit of the sun and moon had previously maintained regular celestial cycles, began gaining ground on their quarry as the cosmic order's stability weakened. Skoll, whose name meant treachery, displayed supernatural speed and endurance that allowed him to close the distance separating him from the sun, despite the solar orb's attempts to maintain its established orbital pattern. The wolf's approach created visible effects in the sun's behaviour, as its light flickered and dimmed whenever the predator drew particularly close. Skoll's physical appearance embodied the destructive forces he represented, with fur that appeared black as the void between stars, while his eyes burned with inner fire that could be seen from vast distances. His size exceeded that of any natural wolf by enormous margins, with paws that left craters in the earth where he touched down during his celestial pursuit, and jaws that could encompass entire mountain peaks. His breathing created windstorms that affected weather patterns across multiple realms, while his howls generated sound waves that shattered stone and drove mortal listeners to madness. Hati, whose name meant hatred, pursued the moon with similar determination and supernatural capabilities that allowed him to match his prey's speed through the night sky. The wolf's approach caused the moon to display phases that followed no natural pattern, waxing and waning according to the distance between hunter and hunted, rather than the celestial mechanics that had previously governed lunar cycles. The moon's light took on a reddish tinge that suggested the presence of blood, while its surface displayed shadows that moved independently of any external light source. The lunar wolf's appearance complemented his solar counterpart while displaying distinct characteristics that reflected his nocturnal nature. Hati's fur possessed a silver-grey coloration that allowed him to blend with moonlight and shadow, making his approach nearly invisible until he drew close enough for his prey to sense immediate danger. His eyes glowed with cold fire that provided illumination without warmth, while his movements created disturbances in the fabric of night itself that manifested as areas of deeper darkness that seemed to absorb rather than merely block light. The gradual consumption of celestial bodies created progressive darkening that affected both practical activities and psychological states throughout the inhabited realms. Daylight hours shortened beyond the normal winter solstice patterns, while the reduced solar illumination made it difficult to distinguish between dawn, noon, and dusk during the brief periods when the sun remained visible. Agricultural activities that depended on solar energy ceased entirely, while navigation became increasingly challenging as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath snow cover and celestial reference points became unreliable. Earthquake activity increased dramatically throughout the Fimbul winter period, with seismic events occurring at frequencies and intensities that exceeded any previous geological records. These tremors originated from sources that appeared to be distributed throughout the cosmic structure, rather than concentrated in specific fault lines or volcanic regions, suggesting that the earthquakes resulted from fundamental instabilities in the world's foundations rather than normal geological processes. The pattern of seismic activity revealed systematic weakening of the bonds that held the cosmic architecture together. Initial tremors affected primarily the surface layers of the Earth, causing landslides and structural damage to human settlements while leaving deeper geological formations relatively undisturbed. However, subsequent earthquakes penetrated to greater depths, affecting the root systems of Yggdrasil and the foundations of mountains that served as anchor points for the cosmic framework. Yggdrasil's response to the increasing seismic activity became visible to observers throughout the Nine Realms, as the World Tree's massive trunk began displaying signs of structural stress that had never been observed in previous ages. The tree's bark developed fissures that leaked a luminous sap possessing properties that differed significantly from normal tree secretions. This substance glowed with its own light, while displaying the ability to flow upward against gravity, creating streams of illumination that traced the tree's surface in patterns that seemed to correspond to the flow of cosmic forces through its structure. The World Tree's leaves began changing colour outside their normal seasonal patterns, displaying hues that ranged from deep purple to brilliant silver, depending on their position within the cosmic framework. Leaves in areas affected by particular stresses turned black and fell prematurely, creating bare patches in the tree's canopy that allowed unprecedented views of the cosmic architecture, normally hidden by foliage. The fallen leaves retained their supernatural properties after separation from the tree, continuing to glow with inner light while displaying the ability to move against wind currents as if guided by conscious will. The creatures that inhabited Yggdrasil's structure displayed increasingly agitated behaviour as the cosmic instabilities affected their normal routines and territories. The eagle that perched in the tree's crown began crying out with sounds that carried across all 9 realms, its calls serving as warnings of approaching danger, while also expressing the distress of a being whose cosmic perspective allowed it to perceive threats that remained hidden from other observers. The 4 stags that fed on the tree's foliage increased their consumption dramatically, stripping branches bare in their urgency to gather sustenance before the tree's deteriorating condition made such feeding impossible. Ratatoska's message-carrying activities between the eagle and the dragon Nidhogger intensified during this period, with the squirrel displaying unprecedented speed and agitation as it scurried up and down the world tree's trunk. The messages it carried became increasingly hostile and provocative, suggesting that the cosmic instabilities were affecting even the communication systems that had previously maintained some degree of stability between opposing forces. The squirrel's own appearance began showing signs of the stress affecting all of Yggdrasil's inhabitants, with its fur taking on a manic gleam, while its movements became jerky and unpredictable. Nidhogger's gnawing at the world tree's roots accelerated dramatically during the Fimbul winter, as the dragon sensed the approaching opportunity to complete its eternal work of cosmic destruction. The creature's increased activity generated vibrations that could be felt throughout the root system, creating sympathetic tremors in distant parts of the tree that contributed to the overall destabilization of the cosmic framework. The dragon's venom, which had previously been contained within the root system's deeper levels, began seeping upward through the tree's structure and contaminating water sources throughout multiple realms. The liberation of previously bound monsters and malevolent forces began occurring as the cosmic restraints that had maintained order started failing under the accumulated stresses of the Fimbul winter. Creatures that had been imprisoned through divine magic or natural barriers found themselves able to break free as the power sources that maintained their confinement weakened or became disrupted by the environmental chaos surrounding them. Loki's bonds beneath the earth began showing signs of deterioration as the earthquakes generated by his struggles increased in intensity and frequency. The stone slabs that held him in place developed cracks that allowed him greater freedom of movement, while the magical chains forged from his son's entrails stretched under the pressure of his enhanced strength. His wife Sigin's vigil became increasingly difficult to maintain as the cavern around them suffered structural damage that made her position dangerous, though her loyalty prevented her from abandoning her post despite the personal risk. The serpent positioned above Loki's head to drip venom onto his face began displaying more aggressive behaviour as the cosmic instabilities affected its supernatural nature. The creature's venom became more potent and corrosive, burning through stone and metal that had previously been immune to its effects, while also increasing the volume of toxic liquid that Sigin's bowl could not entirely contain. The overflow of venom created pools of corrosive material that ate through the cavern floor and contaminated underground water sources, spreading poison throughout the root systems that connected different parts of the cosmic framework. Fenrir's struggles against the chain Gleipnir intensified dramatically as the wolf sensed the approaching time of his liberation and revenge against the gods who had betrayed his trust. The magical binding that had held him securely for so long began showing signs of wear, as the cosmic forces that had powered its creation became disrupted by the overall breakdown of natural order. The wolf's howls of rage and anticipation carried through underground passages and emerged from caves and crevices across multiple realms, serving as rallying calls for other enemies of the gods who recognized the sound as a signal that the time for revenge was approaching. Other bound beings throughout the 9 realms experienced similar loosening of their restraints as the magical and physical systems that had maintained their imprisonment lost effectiveness. giants who had been trapped beneath mountains found themselves able to move the stone barriers that had held them, while various monsters that had been sealed in caves or underwater prisons discovered that their confinements no longer possessed the supernatural strength that had previously made escape impossible. The psychological effect of these liberations created waves of fear and anticipation that affected both divine and mortal populations throughout the cosmic system. The gods recognized that the breakdown of imprisonment systems represented a fundamental threat to their continued dominance, while mortals understood that the release of supernatural predators would create dangers that their communities were ill-equipped to handle. The knowledge that ancient enemies were stirring created an atmosphere of tension and dread that compounded the practical challenges of surviving the Fimbul winter conditions. Military preparations by various factions accelerated as the approaching liberation of major threats became apparent to observers throughout the Nine Realms. The giants of Jotunheim began mobilizing their forces for the anticipated final battle, while dark elves and other enemies of divine order started forging alliances that would allow them to coordinate their efforts effectively. The gods responded by intensifying their own preparations, expanding the Einherjar forces in Valhalla, while also developing new weapons and tactics designed to be effective against the supernatural enemies they would soon face. Human populations caught between these preparing forces found themselves in increasingly desperate situations as their normal sources of protection and authority became focused on cosmic rather than local concerns. The breakdown of social order that had begun with resource competition during the Fimbul winter accelerated as people realized that the fundamental structures governing their world were failing, leaving them to face an uncertain future without the guidance and protection they had previously taken for granted. The accumulated stresses of the Fimbul winter finally reached their breaking point as the magical bonds that had held Loki beneath the earth for so long gave way under the relentless pressure of cosmic instability. The earthquakes generated by his struggles had weakened the stone slabs positioned above him, while the supernatural cold had made the rock brittle and prone to fracturing. The chains fashioned from his son Narfi's entrails, which had maintained their binding power through divine magic, began losing their supernatural strength as the cosmic order that sustained such enchantments deteriorated under the assault of chaotic forces. The moment of Loki's liberation occurred without dramatic fanfare. A simple crack in the stone that widened enough to allow him to slip his bonds, followed by the dissolution of the intestinal chains that crumbled to dust as their magical properties finally expired. His emergence from the underground cavern revealed the physical toll of his long imprisonment, as his divine form bore the scars of constant exposure to serpent venom, while his eyes burned with accumulated hatred that had intensified during every moment of his captivity. The pale, almost translucent quality of his skin reflected years without sunlight, while his movements displayed a careful deliberation that suggested muscles and joints stiffened by prolonged immobility. Sigyn's reaction to her husband's freedom combined relief with apprehension, as she recognized that his liberation meant the beginning of events that would reshape the cosmic order entirely. Her appearance showed the effects of her long vigil, hair completely white, hands scarred from holding the bowl that caught the serpent's venom, and clothing worn to tatters from years of underground existence. Yet her eyes retained the intelligence and loyalty that had sustained her through the ordeal, though she now understood that her husband's transformation during imprisonment had created a being whose motivations extended far beyond personal revenge into cosmic destruction. Loki's first actions upon gaining freedom involved testing his supernatural abilities to determine what powers remained intact after his prolonged confinement. His shape-shifting capabilities had been suppressed by the binding spell, but their return came gradually as he experimented with minor transformations, altering his facial features, changing his hair colour, adjusting his height and build. The process proved more difficult than before his imprisonment, requiring conscious effort and concentration that had previously been unnecessary. suggesting that the binding had created permanent limitations on his supernatural flexibility. His magical abilities showed similar signs of diminishment, though they retained enough potency to make him a formidable threat to cosmic stability. Fire magic that had once come as naturally as breathing now required deliberate invocation and consumed more of his energy than previously, while his capacity for illusion and deception remained strong, but lacked the effortless quality that had characterized his earlier exploits. The limitations frustrated him while simultaneously increasing his determination to achieve maximum destruction with the resources at his disposal. The transformation of Loki's motivations during his imprisonment had evolved far beyond simple desire for revenge against the gods who had bound him. His years of suffering had created a philosophical opposition to the entire cosmic order that the Aesir represented, making him an enemy not just of individual divine beings, but of the concepts of law, hierarchy, and stability that their rule embodied. His goal had become the complete overthrow of existing reality, and its replacement with a chaotic system where power flowed according to cunning and strength, rather than inherited authority or moral righteousness. His recruitment of allies began immediately upon his liberation, as he sought out other beings who harboured grievances against the current cosmic order or who would benefit from its destruction. The giants of Jotunheim provided his most natural constituency, as their ancient enmity with the gods had been exacerbated by centuries of territorial disputes, broken treaties, and cultural conflicts that made peaceful coexistence impossible. His approach to potential giant allies emphasized shared interests in overthrowing divine hegemony, while downplaying his personal motivations for revenge. The giant strongholds of Jotunheim had undergone significant military development during Loki's imprisonment, as their inhabitants recognized that eventual conflict with the gods was inevitable and prepared accordingly. Massive fortifications built from stone blocks weighing several tons each protected strategic mountain passes and river crossings, while workshops produced weapons specifically designed to be effective against divine opponents. The giants had learned to work with metals and magical materials that could penetrate divine defences, creating arsenals that posed genuine threats to Aesir military superiority. Utgard, the giants' primary fortress city, had expanded dramatically during the Fimbulwinter, as refugees from smaller settlements sought protection within its walls. The city's architecture reflected both defensive necessity and the chaotic aesthetic preferences of its inhabitants, with buildings that incorporated natural rock formations into their design, while displaying asymmetrical layouts that confused potential attackers. The streets followed no systematic pattern, creating a maze-like environment that favoured defenders familiar with the territory, while hindering invading forces attempting to navigate towards strategic objectives. The giant population itself had grown more militaristic during the period of Loki's imprisonment, with traditional occupations like farming and craftsmanship being supplemented by weapons training and tactical education that prepared civilians for participation in large-scale warfare. Giant society had always valued physical strength and combat prowess, but the approaching conflict had transformed these cultural preferences into systematic military preparation that involved entire communities rather than just professional warriors. Loki's negotiations with giant leaders required careful diplomatic manoeuvring, as his previous actions had created mixed reactions within their community. Some giants viewed him as a valuable ally whose cunning and inside knowledge of Asgard's defences made him an asset worth supporting, while others remained suspicious of his motivations and concerned that his personal vendetta against the gods might compromise strategic decision-making during the anticipated conflict. His success in gaining their support depended on demonstrating that his goals aligned with their own interests in overthrowing divine rule. The breaking of Fenrir's bonds occurred almost simultaneously with Loki's liberation, as the magical chain Gleipnir finally succumbed to the accumulated stress of the wolf's struggles and the cosmic instabilities that had weakened all supernatural restraints. The chain's dissolution released not just the wolf's physical form, but also years of accumulated rage that had intensified during every moment of his captivity. His emergence from the underground cavern where he had been imprisoned revealed a creature whose size and power had continued growing despite his confinement, creating a predator whose capabilities exceeded even the dire predictions that had motivated his original binding. Fenrir's appearance had become even more terrifying during his imprisonment, as his fur had darkened to an absolute black that seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflecting it. His eyes glowed within a fire that provided illumination in darkness, while simultaneously conveying the intelligence and hatred that drove his desire for revenge against the gods who had betrayed him. His size had increased to the point where his shoulder height matched that of a large horse, while his jaws had developed the capacity to crush stone and metal with ease. The wolf's first act upon gaining freedom involved testing his enhanced capabilities against the landscape around his former prison, as he used his claws to carve deep gouges in solid rock and his teeth to shatter boulders that blocked his path. These demonstrations served both practical and psychological purposes, allowing him to assess his current strength while also releasing some of the violent energy that had built up during his confinement. The destruction he caused created visible scars across the terrain that would serve as permanent reminders of his liberation and the threat he represented. Fenrir's reunion with his father Loki carried complex emotional undertones, as both beings had been transformed by their respective imprisonments in ways that affected their relationship. The wolf's loyalty to his father remained intact, but his years of suffering had created an independent agenda focused specifically on revenge against Tyr and the other gods who had participated in his binding. His willingness to cooperate with Loki's broader plans depended on ensuring that his personal enemies would face appropriate punishment during the coming conflict. The wolf's strategic value to the forces opposing divine rule extended beyond his individual combat capabilities to include his symbolic importance as a being who had been wronged by the gods despite initially showing them loyalty and trust. His story provided propaganda value that could be used to recruit other potential allies who harboured grievances against divine authority, while his presence served as visible proof that the gods' protective measures had failed and their enemies were gaining strength. Jormungandra's emergence from the depths of the ocean surrounding Midgard created environmental catastrophes that affected coastal regions throughout the inhabited world. The world serpent's movements as he rose from the seafloor generated massive tsunamis that devastated human settlements along shorelines, while his breathing released clouds of toxic vapour that poisoned the air across vast areas. The serpent's venom, which had been contained within his body during his long residence in the ocean depths, now began affecting the atmosphere itself as his exhalations created poisonous clouds that drifted inland on prevailing winds. The serpent's size had continued increasing during his oceanic residence, as his coils now encircled not just Midgard, but extended into the waters surrounding other realms connected to the same cosmic ocean system. His scales had developed a metallic quality that reflected light in patterns resembling flowing mercury, while his eyes had grown to the size of shields and glowed with bioluminescence that could be seen from enormous distances. His movements through the water created currents and whirlpools that affected shipping and fishing throughout the maritime regions of multiple realms. The environmental impact of Jormungandra's surfacing extended beyond immediate physical destruction to include long-term contamination that would affect the habitability of coastal areas for generations. The venom in his breath reacted with seawater to create corrosive compounds that killed marine life and contaminated fresh water sources through groundwater infiltration. Vegetation exposed to his toxic exhalations withered and died, creating dead zones that expanded outward from the areas of heaviest contamination. The psychological effect of the world serpent's emergence on human populations created panic that spread far beyond the areas directly affected by his presence. Sailors reported sightings of massive coils breaking the ocean surface at distances that made accurate measurement impossible, while coastal communities experienced the terror of watching their familiar seascape transform into an alien environment dominated by a creature whose size defied comprehension. The knowledge that such a being existed in their world fundamentally altered human understanding of their place in the cosmic hierarchy. Jormungandra's reunion with his father and brother created a family dynamic that combined affection with shared purpose in ways that amplified the threat they posed to cosmic stability. The three beings had all suffered imprisonment or exile due to divine fears about their potential for destruction, creating common cause that transcended normal family relationships. Their cooperation represented not just personal alliance, but ideological unity in opposition to the cosmic order that had treated them as threats to be contained rather than beings deserving of respect and freedom. The assembly of the armies of destruction began as news of these liberations spread throughout the realms, where enemies of divine rule had been waiting for signs that the time for action had arrived. The dishonoured dead who'd been denied entry to Valhalla due to the manner of their deaths or their behaviour in life began stirring in their graves as supernatural forces called them to service in the final battle. These revenant warriors possessed the combat skills they had developed during life while being freed from the physical limitations that mortality had imposed upon them. The ship Naglfar, constructed entirely from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, began its supernatural assembly as the cosmic forces driving toward Ragnarok drew these materials from burial sites throughout the 9 realms. The vessel's construction followed no conventional shipbuilding techniques, as the nail fragments fused together through magical processes that created a hull capable of sailing through both water and air while carrying enormous numbers of passengers. The ship's appearance was both magnificent and horrifying, with a hull that gleamed like polished bone while displaying the natural ridges and textures of its unusual construction material. The crew of Naglfar consisted of beings who had been rejected by both the divine and mortal communities, creating a collection of outcasts whose diverse backgrounds and motivations were unified only by their shared opposition to the existing cosmic order. Dishonoured warriors who had broken oaths or committed acts that violated the codes of honourable combat found themselves serving alongside criminals who had been executed for their crimes and monsters who had been banished from civilized society for their dangerous natures. The ship's capacity seemed to expand according to the number of beings seeking passage, as its supernatural construction allowed it to accommodate armies whose size would have overwhelmed any conventional vessel. The dead who boarded Naglfar found their individual identities partially subsumed into a collective consciousness focused on destruction and revenge, though they retained enough personal awareness to remember the specific grievances that motivated their participation in the coming conflict. Navigation of Naglfar required no conventional sailing skills, as the ship responded to the will of its passengers and the cosmic currents that were drawing all forces toward the final battlefield. The vessel could travel through solid matter as easily as through water or air, allowing it to emerge from underground caverns or rise from ocean depths without regard for normal physical limitations. Its passage left no wake or trace that could be followed by conventional means, making it impossible for the gods to track its movements or predict where it would appear next. The rallying of divine forces in Asgard began as soon as the gods became aware of their enemies' liberation and the gathering of hostile armies throughout the 9 realms. Odin's response to these developments combined his strategic knowledge gained through years of seeking wisdom about Ragnarok, with practical military preparations designed to maximize the gods' chances of survival in the predicted final battle. His commands mobilized not just the Aesir themselves, but also their allies among the Light Elves, Loyal Giants, and other beings who supported the existing cosmic order. The Einherjar housed in Valhalla represented the gods' primary military asset, as these chosen warriors had been selected specifically for their combat skills and their willingness to fight to the death in service of divine causes. The hall's capacity had been expanded repeatedly during the period leading up to Ragnarok, with new construction that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of warriors while providing training facilities that allowed them to maintain and improve their combat effectiveness. The Einherjar's daily routine of fighting each other to the death and then being restored to life for feasting created a warrior culture that viewed death in battle as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent ending. The weapons and armour provided to the Einherjar incorporated the finest craftsmanship available from the Dark Elves of Nidavellir, with equipment that had been specifically designed for effectiveness against supernatural opponents. Swords forged from metals that existed only in the cosmic framework possessed edges that could cut through divine flesh and magical protections, while armour incorporated defensive enchantments that could deflect attacks from beings whose strength exceeded normal physical limitations. Shields bore runes that provided protection against magical assaults, while helmets included vision enhancements that allowed warriors to perceive supernatural beings that might otherwise remain invisible. The training regimen for the Einherjar had been intensified as reports of enemy preparations reached Asgard, with combat exercises that simulated the conditions expected during the final battle. Warriors practiced fighting in environments affected by supernatural weather, toxic atmospheres, and unstable terrain that would characterize the battlefield where Ragnarok would unfold. They learned to coordinate their efforts with divine allies whose combat styles and capabilities differed significantly from mortal fighting techniques, while also developing tactics for facing opponents whose supernatural abilities made conventional military strategies ineffective. Odin's personal preparations for the coming conflict involved both military and magical elements that reflected his understanding of the cosmic forces involved in Ragnarok. His spear Gungnir had been enhanced with additional enchantments that increased its accuracy and penetrating power, while his armour incorporated protective runes that had been developed specifically to defend against the types of attacks he expected to face from Fenrir and other supernatural enemies. His magical abilities had been expanded through continued study of Seidr techniques and consultation with the Norns about strategies that might influence the battle's outcome. The Allfather's strategic planning took into account not just the immediate military challenges of the final battle, but also the broader cosmic implications of the conflict's resolution. His goal extended beyond simple victory over the forces of chaos, to include ensuring that something of value would survive Ragnarok's destruction, to form the foundation for whatever cosmic order might emerge from the ashes of the current system. This long-term perspective influenced his tactical decisions and resource allocation in ways that sometimes conflicted with short-term military effectiveness. The other Aesir gods prepared for battle according to their individual capabilities and the specific roles they were expected to play during the conflict. Thor's preparations focused on his anticipated confrontation with Jormungandr, as prophecy indicated that their mutual destruction would represent one of the climactic moments of the final battle. His hammer Mjolnir received additional enchantments that increased its effectiveness against serpentine opponents, while his strength was enhanced through magical rituals that drew power from thunder and lightning throughout the 9 realms. Tyr's preparations carried particular emotional weight due to his personal history with Fenrir and the knowledge that their confrontation would involve not just combat, but the resolution of betrayal and broken trust that had contributed to the cosmic crisis. His missing hand, sacrificed to secure Fenrir's original binding, served as a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for temporary security and the debt that would eventually come due during the final reckoning. Freya's role in the coming conflict involved both military and magical elements, as her mastery of Seidr magic provided capabilities that complemented the more direct combat approaches favoured by the male gods. Her preparations included the training of additional practitioners in the magical arts that would be necessary for countering the supernatural abilities of their enemies, while her knowledge of death magic would prove crucial for dealing with the revenant armies sailing aboard Naglfar. The mobilization of allied forces throughout the 9 realms created a complex web of military preparations that involved coordination between groups whose normal relationships ranged from friendly cooperation to suspicious neutrality. The Light Elves of Alfheim contributed their mastery of light-based magic and their knowledge of cosmic harmonies that could be used to disrupt the chaotic forces supporting their enemies. Their weapons, created from concentrated radiance, provided capabilities that complemented the more conventional armaments produced by the Dark Elves, while their ability to manipulate illumination would prove valuable during battles conducted in the supernatural darkness that accompanied Ragnarok. Human participation in the divine conflict remained limited by their mortal nature and their lack of supernatural abilities, though some exceptional individuals received divine blessing that allowed them to contribute to the war effort. These chosen mortals served primarily as scouts and messengers who could operate in areas too dangerous for divine beings to enter directly, while their knowledge of local conditions provided intelligence that proved valuable for strategic planning. The cosmic stage was now set for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the existing order and the nature of whatever reality might emerge from its destruction. The vast plain of Vigrid stretched endlessly beneath a sky that had lost all semblance of natural colour, its surface transformed into a battlefield whose dimensions defied mortal comprehension. This ancient expanse, located in the realm between worlds where cosmic forces converged, had been prophesied as the site where gods and giants would meet for their final confrontation. The ground itself bore witness to its supernatural significance, composed of crystallized earth that rang like metal beneath the feet of warriors, while displaying veins of luminous minerals that pulsed with the rhythm of cosmic heartbeats. The plane's geography had been shaped by forces that preceded the current cosmic order, its flat expanses interrupted by formations of black stone that jutted from the earth, like the bones of primordial giants. These monolithic structures served as both landmarks and tactical positions during the unfolding battle, their surfaces carved with runic inscriptions that recorded the names and deeds of warriors who had fallen in conflicts spanning multiple cosmic ages. The stones themselves possessed supernatural properties that amplified the sounds of battle while creating acoustic effects that carried war cries and death screams across impossible distances. Streams of water that flowed across Vigrid's surface carried no ordinary liquid, but instead channeled the concentrated essence of fate itself, their currents running red with the blood of future casualties while reflecting images of battles yet to be fought. Warriors who glimpsed these prophetic waters often saw their own deaths mirrored in the flowing streams, though such knowledge rarely deterred them from their predetermined courses of action. The water's temperature remained constant regardless of weather conditions, maintaining a warmth that suggested connection to the life forces of all beings destined to participate in the cosmic conflict. The arrival of combatants on Vigrid occurred through various supernatural means that reflected their diverse origins and natures. The gods descended from Asgard via the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, which had been reinforced with additional magical supports to handle the unprecedented traffic of divine armies marching toward their final battle. The bridge's crystalline structure groaned under the weight of armoured warriors, while its colours shifted from the familiar spectrum of natural rainbows to hues that existed only in supernatural realms, deep purples that absorbed light, silver that cut through darkness, and gold that burned with inner fire. Heimdall's position at the bridge's terminus allowed him to observe the gathering forces while maintaining his vigil against potential threats to Asgard's security. The Guardian's enhanced senses detected the approach of enemy armies long before they became visible to ordinary perception. His ability to see across vast distances and hear the footsteps of ants, providing early warning of the massive forces converging on the battlefield. His horn Yalahorn remained ready to sound the final alarm that would signal the beginning of combat, though the need for such announcement had become academic as the opposing armies took their positions in full view of each other. The Einherjar marched in formation across Bifrost with discipline that reflected their constant training in Valhalla's halls, their armour clanking in rhythmic patterns that created a martial symphony audible throughout multiple realms. Each warrior bore weapons that had been personally blessed by the gods and forged by the most skilled craftsmen in Nidavellir, their equipment incorporating materials that existed nowhere else in creation. The warriors' faces displayed the calm determination of beings who had already died once in battle, and therefore faced death without the fear that affected mortal combatants. Odin rode at the head of the divine army mounted on Sleipnir, whose 8 legs carried the All-Father across the bridge's span with supernatural grace that made the journey appear effortless despite the horse's enormous burden of rider and equipment. The god's appearance had been transformed by his knowledge of the approaching doom, his single eye burning with accumulated wisdom, while his features bore the weight of understanding fate's inexorable progression. His spear Gungnir gleamed with enchantments that made the weapon visible from vast distances, its point trailing streams of light that marked his position for both allies and enemies. Thor's arrival on the battlefield created thunderous sounds that echoed across Vigrid's expanse, as his chariot, drawn by the goats Tangrisnir and Tangjosta, descended from the storm clouds that perpetually surrounded his aerial vehicle. The thunder god's hammer Mjolnir sparked with electrical energy that illuminated the darkened sky while creating ozone scents that mixed with the metallic odours of assembled weapons. His red beard bristled with barely contained fury as he surveyed the enemy forces, his eyes already seeking the massive form of Jormungandr among the chaotic assemblage of hostile beings. The giant armies approached Vigrid through underground passages that connected their mountain strongholds to the battlefield's periphery, their emergence from cavern mouths creating the impression of the earth itself giving birth to hostile forces. The frost giants' appearance created localized weather changes as their bodies radiated supernatural cold that froze moisture from the air and created ice crystals that fell like snow around their positions. Their weapons, forged from meteoric iron and blessed with curses that increased their effectiveness against divine opponents, gleamed with dark light that seemed to absorb rather than reflect illumination. Fire giants from Muspelheim arrived through portals of flame that tore holes in the fabric of reality itself, their passage leaving burning gashes in the air that continued smouldering long after their craters had passed through. Surtur's massive form dominated the southern approach to the battlefield, his flaming sword casting light that rivaled the sun while generating heat that could be felt across the entire plain. The fire giant's presence caused the crystalline ground beneath his feet to glow red-hot, while creating thermal updrafts that affected weather patterns throughout the region. Mountain giants approached with earth-shaking footsteps that created rhythmic tremors throughout Vigrid's structure, their stone-like flesh scarred by centuries of warfare, while their crude weapons incorporated boulders and tree trunks that had been shaped into clubs capable of crushing divine armour. Their leader, whose name had been forgotten during the eons of his existence, stood nearly as tall as the stone monuments that dotted the battlefield, while his voice carried the rumbling quality of avalanches when he issued commands to his followers. Loki's arrival at the head of the dishonoured dead, sailing aboard Naglfar, created one of the most unsettling spectacles witnessed during the gathering of forces. The ship materialised from underground waters that had no connection to any known ocean system, its hull gleaming with the pale luminescence of polished bone, while its supernatural construction allowed it to sail across solid ground as easily as through liquid. The vessel's capacity seemed to expand continuously as more revenant warriors boarded from hidden locations throughout the 9 realms, their numbers growing beyond any possibility of accurate count. The dishonoured dead who served as Naglfar's crew and passengers displayed the wounds that had caused their deaths while retaining the combat skills that had made them formidable opponents during their mortal lives. Their equipment consisted of weapons and armour that had been buried with them, now restored to supernatural effectiveness through the magical forces that had recalled them to service. Their eyes glowed with cold fire that provided illumination without warmth, while their movements carried the eerie grace of beings no longer constrained by the limitations of living flesh. Fenrir's presence on the battlefield created an aura of menace that affected both allied and enemy forces, as the wolf's size and supernatural abilities made him a threat to any being who approached too closely. His black fur absorbed light so completely that his form appeared as a moving void against the crystalline ground, while his eyes provided the only points of illumination in his dark silhouette. His breathing created wind currents that carried the scent of ancient hatred mixed with the metallic odour of blood, while his movements generated subsonic vibrations that could be felt through the ground by sensitive individuals. Jormungandr's approach to Vigrid required the world serpent to partially emerge from the ocean that surrounded Midgard, his massive coils creating tidal waves that affected coastlines throughout multiple realms. The serpent's venom-laden breath preceded his physical arrival, creating toxic clouds that drifted across the battlefield while poisoning the air and forcing combatants to take protective measures against the corrosive vapours. His scales reflected the supernatural light emanating from various sources across the plain, while his eyes, each larger than a warrior's shield, surveyed the assembled forces with predatory intelligence. Hel's contribution to the forces opposing divine rule came in the form of additional armies of the dead, who marched from her realm in Helheim to join the conflict. These beings differed from the dishonoured dead aboard Naglfar, in that they had died from disease or old age, rather than in battle, their supernatural resurrection granting them combat abilities they had never possessed during their mortal existences. Their appearance reflected their manner of death. Some bore the wasted features of plague victims, while others displayed the frailty of extreme age, yet all moved with supernatural strength and endurance that made them formidable opponents. The goddess herself arrived riding a horse whose bones were visible through translucent flesh, her half-living, half-dead appearance creating a striking contrast against the chaotic backdrop of the assembling armies. Her living side bore armour that gleamed with divine radiance, while her dead side displayed the decay and corruption associated with her role as ruler of the deceased. Her presence on the battlefield served both tactical and symbolic purposes, as her authority over death itself would prove crucial during a conflict where the boundary between life and death would be repeatedly crossed. The positioning of forces across Vigrid's expanse followed patterns that reflected both tactical considerations and the cosmic significance of the various participants. The gods established their lines along the northern edge of the plain, their formations incorporating the disciplined ranks of Einherjar, supported by divine champions whose individual capabilities could affect the outcome of entire sections of the battlefield. The gods' position allowed them to maintain communication with Asgard, while providing clear fields of view across the entire combat area. The giant armies arrayed themselves along the southern and eastern approaches to the plain, their less disciplined formations reflecting their chaotic nature while still maintaining enough organisation to coordinate their attacks effectively. The different types of giants, frost, fire and mountain, positioned themselves according to their environmental preferences and tactical capabilities, creating a diverse force that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Loki's forces occupied the western edge of Vigrid, their position allowing them to serve as a mobile reserve that could respond to developments throughout the battle while also providing a base of operations for the supernatural beings whose abilities required specific environmental conditions. Naglfar served as both command centre and transportation hub for these forces, its ability to move across any terrain making it an invaluable tactical asset. The initial engagements began not with formal declarations or ceremonial challenges, but with the inevitable collision of opposing forces whose hatred had been building for eons. The first combat occurred when advanced scouts from different armies encountered each other while conducting reconnaissance of the battlefield, their skirmishes escalating into larger conflicts as reinforcements arrived to support their embattled comrades. Odin's confrontation with Fenrir represented the culmination of a relationship that had evolved from mutual respect through betrayal to implacable hatred. The All-Father approached the wolf with Gungnir held ready, his single eye meeting the burning gaze of his opponent while both beings acknowledged the significance of their impending duel. The god's strategy relied on his superior reach and the magical properties of his spear, while the wolf's advantages lay in his supernatural strength and the burning desire for revenge that had sustained him through years of imprisonment. The initial exchange between god and wolf occurred with lightning speed that made their movements difficult for observers to follow, Odin's spear thrusting toward Fenrir's heart, while the wolf's jaws snapped toward the god's throat. The Allfather's combat experience and tactical knowledge allowed him to avoid the wolf's first attack while landing a glancing blow that drew divine blood from his opponent's shoulder. Fenrir's response demonstrated the enhanced capabilities he had developed during his imprisonment, as his claws raked across Odin's armour while leaving deep gouges in the divine metal. The duel's progression revealed the fundamental mismatch between the combatants' approaches to warfare, as Odin relied on skill and magical enhancement, while Fenrir fought with pure savage fury that overwhelmed defensive techniques through sheer intensity. The god's attempts to maintain distance and use his spear's reach advantage were repeatedly frustrated by the wolf's supernatural speed and his ability to close gaps that should have provided safety. The wolf's size and strength allowed him to treat Odin's armour as merely another obstacle to be overcome rather than effective protection against his attacks. The climactic moment of their confrontation arrived when Fenrir's jaws finally closed around Odin's head and neck, the wolf's teeth penetrating even the enhanced protection of divine armour, while his bite delivered the vengeance he had planned throughout his long imprisonment. The Allfather's death sent shockwaves through the divine forces, while simultaneously fulfilling one of the most significant prophecies associated with Ragnarok, marking a turning point in the battle's progression. Thor's battle with Jormungandr unfolded simultaneously across a different section of the battlefield, as the Thunder God sought to prevent the world serpent's venom from contaminating the entire combat area. The god's approach involved using Mjolnir's electrical properties to create lightning strikes that would neutralize the toxic clouds, while simultaneously damaging the serpent's massive form. His strategy required him to maintain aerial position, using his storm powers while avoiding direct contact with the creature's venomous breath. The serpent's tactics focused on using his size and the environmental hazards created by his presence to limit Thor's mobility, while forcing the god into positions where his hammer's effectiveness would be reduced. Jormungandr's movements across the battlefield created obstacles that affected other combats, while his venom clouds forced warriors from both sides to seek higher ground or protective cover. The creature's intelligence allowed him to coordinate his attacks with those of other enemy forces, creating combined threats that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. The decisive exchange between Thor and Jormungandr occurred when the god succeeded in landing a hammer blow directly on the serpent's skull, the impact generating thunderous sounds that could be heard throughout multiple realms while creating electrical discharges that illuminated the darkened battlefield. The strike proved fatal to the world serpent, whose massive form began convulsing as divine lightning coursed through his nervous system. However, the creature's death throes released concentrated clouds of venom that enveloped Thor despite his attempts to escape, the toxic vapours penetrating his divine constitution and causing his collapse within 9 steps of his victory. Freya's confrontation with Surtur represented a clash between opposing elemental forces, as the god's association with fertility and growth faced the fire giant's embodiment of destruction and consumption. The Vanir god's disadvantage in this matchup had been predetermined by his earlier decision to trade away his magical sword in exchange for love, leaving him armed only with conventional weapons against an opponent whose supernatural abilities made normal combat techniques ineffective. The fire giant's approach to battle involved using his flaming sword to create barriers of supernatural fire that prevented his opponent from closing to effective combat range, while simultaneously generating heat that affected Freya's ability to maintain his divine powers. Surtur's movements across the battlefield left trails of molten stone that created permanent changes to Vigrid's geography, while his presence raised ambient temperatures throughout the combat area. Freyr's strategy relied on his knowledge of natural forces and his ability to manipulate plant growth even under adverse conditions, as he attempted to use the battlefield's supernatural properties to create vegetation that could resist the fire giant's attacks. His efforts produced results that demonstrated his divine power while ultimately proving insufficient against an opponent whose nature represented the antithesis of everything he embodied. The god's death at Surtur's hands eliminated one of the few divine beings whose powers might have contributed to post-Ragnarok renewal, ensuring that the coming destruction would be more complete than it might otherwise have been. The broader battle continued raging across Vigrid's expanse as individual duels determined the fates of cosmic forces, while lesser combatants engaged in conflicts that would have been considered epic under normal circumstances. The Einherjar fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds, their training and equipment allowing them to inflict significant casualties on their enemies, while gradually being overwhelmed by superior numbers and supernatural abilities. The climactic moment of divine defeat marked only the beginning of Surtur's true purpose, as the fire giant's victory over Freyr freed him to fulfill his cosmic role as the agent of universal purification through flame. The giant's flaming sword, which had blazed throughout the battle with intensity that rivaled solar fire, now began expanding its destructive reach beyond the confines of individual combat into a force capable of consuming entire realms. The weapon's blade stretched across impossible distances as Surtur raised it above his head, its edge cutting through the fabric of reality itself while releasing torrents of primordial fire that had been contained since the cosmos's earliest moments. The fire that erupted from Surtur's sword possessed qualities that distinguished it fundamentally from ordinary combustion, burning without requiring fuel while consuming materials that should have been immune to normal flames. Divine metals that had withstood millennia of use in godly weapons melted like wax when exposed to these supernatural fires, while the crystalline ground of Vigrid began flowing like liquid as temperatures exceeded anything previously experienced in the material universe. The flames displayed colours that existed beyond the normal spectrum of visible light, deep crimsons that seemed to burn from within darkness itself, brilliant whites that seared the vision of anyone who looked directly upon them, and shifting hues that changed according to the nature of whatever they consumed. The expansion of the conflagration followed patterns that reflected cosmic architecture rather than natural fire behaviour, as the flames spread along the pathways that connected different realms through Yggdrasil's root and branch system. The World Tree's wooden structure, despite its supernatural resilience and the daily care provided by the Norns, proved vulnerable to fires that burned at the fundamental level of existence itself. The tree's bark began charring and peeling away in massive sheets that fell like burning snow across the 9 realms, while its sap boiled and hissed as it encountered temperatures that transformed its life-giving properties into toxic vapours. The collapse of Yggdrasil's structural integrity occurred gradually at first, as the massive tree's supernatural constitution allowed it to resist the advancing flames longer than any normal vegetation could have survived. However, the fire's relentless advance eventually reached critical support points where major branches connected to the main trunk, causing catastrophic failures that sent enormous sections of the cosmic framework crashing down across multiple realms. The sound of the World Tree's destruction created acoustic waves that propagated through dimensional barriers, generating earthquakes and atmospheric disturbances that affected regions far from the immediate sites of structural collapse. The tree's roots, which had anchored the cosmic order to fundamental sources of power and stability, began withering as the flames penetrated deep into the underground network that connected all realms through subterranean passages. The Well of Erd, where the Norns had maintained their eternal vigil over fate's weaving, began boiling as supernatural fire reached its sacred waters and transformed them into scalding steam that rose through the root system. The 3 sisters found their cosmic loom consumed by flames that burned the threads of destiny itself, erasing the patterns that had predetermined the course of future events and leaving the post-Ragnarok universe free to develop according to principles not yet established. The Well of Mimir suffered similar destruction as the fire reached its depths and began consuming the accumulated wisdom that had been preserved in its waters for countless ages. Mimir's severed head, which had continued dispensing knowledge even after separation from its body, finally fell silent as the flames reached the neural tissues that had maintained its consciousness. The loss of this repository of cosmic knowledge meant that whatever civilization might emerge from Ragnarok's ashes would lack access to the accumulated learning of previous ages, forcing future generations to rediscover fundamental truths through their own experience and investigation. Hvergelmir, the primordial spring that had fed all cold waters throughout the cosmic system, began generating superheated steam as Surtur's fires reached its source deep within Niflheim's frozen wastes. The interaction between primordial ice and cosmic fire created explosive reactions that sent geysers of scalding water shooting through underground passages, flooding cavern systems, and creating new thermal features across landscapes that had remained stable since creation. The spring's contamination with fire essence transformed its life-giving waters into corrosive liquids that killed rather than nourished whatever they touched. Nidhogger, the dragon that had spent eons gnawing at Yggdrasil's roots, found its destructive work suddenly accelerated beyond its wildest expectations as the advancing flames reached its underground lair. The creature's scales, which had protected it from conventional damage throughout its long existence, proved inadequate against fires that burned at temperatures exceeding those found in stellar cores. The dragon's death throes created additional damage to the root system as its massive body convulsed and thrashed against the already weakened wooden structures, hastening the world tree's complete collapse. The destruction of the cosmic infrastructure connecting the Nine Realms created cascading failures that affected the fundamental laws governing reality in each world. Gravitational fields that had maintained planetary orbits began fluctuating as the magical forces that stabilized them were disrupted by Yggdrasil's collapse, causing celestial bodies to drift from their established courses while generating tidal forces that reshaped coastlines and mountain ranges. The barriers that had separated different realms from each other began breaking down, allowing environmental conditions from one world to bleed into others and creating chaotic mixtures of incompatible physical laws. Asgard's destruction proceeded with particular thoroughness as Surtur's fires consumed the halls and fortifications that had housed divine civilization for millennia. Gladsheim, Odin's primary residence, became a furnace whose golden pillars melted and flowed like rivers of molten metal, while its roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated debris from the burning structure. The hall's interior, which had contained treasures and artifacts accumulated over cosmic ages, saw priceless items reduced to ash and slag as temperatures rose beyond the tolerance of even magically enhanced materials. Valhalla's destruction eliminated the eternal feast hall, where Einherjar had prepared for this very battle, as the building's walls of interlocked shields warped and twisted under extreme heat, while its spear-after roof collapsed in sections that crushed the benches where warriors had celebrated their deaths in combat. The mead that had flowed endlessly from the goat Heidrun evaporated instantly when exposed to the supernatural flames, while the boar Sehrimnir, whose flesh had provided eternal sustenance for the divine warriors, was consumed completely by fires that left no possibility of regeneration. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that had connected Asgard to the other realms, began losing its structural coherence as the crystallized light from which it was constructed proved vulnerable to the cosmic fires spreading from Surtur's sword. The bridge's collapse occurred in spectacular fashion, with each colour band separating and dispersing back into its component wavelengths, while creating prismatic effects that scattered rainbow fragments across the darkening sky. The destruction of this crucial transportation link left Asgard completely isolated during its final moments, preventing any possibility of evacuation or rescue for the divine beings trapped within the burning realm. The light elves of Alfheim faced extinction as their ethereal realm, composed primarily of crystallized radiance and solidified music, proved especially vulnerable to the advancing conflagration. Their cities, built from concentrated beams of sunlight and moonlight, began losing cohesion as the supernatural fires disrupted the harmonic frequencies that maintained their structural integrity. The elves themselves, beings whose bodies consisted largely of living light, found their essential nature threatened by flames that consumed illumination itself rather than merely generating it through combustion. The dark elves of Nidavellir experienced a different form of destruction as the fires reached their underground workshops and forges, creating temperatures that exceeded even their advanced metallurgical capabilities. The tools and weapons they had crafted for the gods throughout the ages melted and fused together into shapeless masses of metal, while their carefully maintained forges exploded when their internal fires encountered the cosmic flames spreading through the world tree's root system. The collapse of tunnel systems that had taken millennia to excavate buried entire communities of craftsmen beneath tons of molten rock and debris. Midgard's submersion began as the cosmic fires caused rapid melting of ice sheets that had accumulated during the Fimbul winter, while simultaneous disruption of ocean currents created massive flooding that overwhelmed coastal defences and swept inland across previously dry territories. The wall constructed from Ymir's eyebrows, which had protected the human realm from external threats since its creation, cracked and crumbled as the foundations supporting it were undermined by rising water levels and the thermal expansion caused by approaching fires. Human settlements that had survived the harsh conditions of the Fimbul winter found themselves facing new challenges as floodwaters contaminated with ash and debris from burning realms created toxic conditions that made survival impossible even for the most adaptable communities. The breakdown of seasonal cycles that had followed natural patterns since agriculture's beginning left farmers unable to predict planting and harvesting times, while the contamination of water sources forced populations to choose between death from thirst and death from poisoning. The psychological impact of witnessing their world's destruction proved as devastating to human populations as the physical threats they faced, as communities that had maintained cultural traditions for generations watched their sacred sites and ancestral lands disappear beneath rising waters or fall victim to advancing flames. The knowledge that their gods had fallen in battle and could no longer provide protection created despair that sapped the will to resist even among groups that possessed the resources necessary for short-term survival. Jotunheim's destruction occurred with particular violence as the fire reached territories where frost giants had built their strongholds from ice and stone that proved inadequate against supernatural combustion. The massive fortifications that had taken centuries to construct collapsed within hours as their foundations melted and their walls lost structural integrity, while the giant inhabitants found their supernatural resistance to cold provided no protection against the cosmic flames that consumed everything in their path. The realm's mountainous terrain channeled the advancing fire into concentrated streams that carved new valleys through solid rock, while creating lava flows that would permanently alter the landscape's character. Vanaheim's fertile valleys, which had remained productive even during the Fimbul winter, due to the Vanir god's mastery of agricultural magic, became furnaces that consumed centuries of careful cultivation in moments. The organic architecture that had incorporated living trees into building design proved especially vulnerable to the advancing flames, as the structure's plant components served as fuel that accelerated rather than resisted the fire's spread. The realm's rivers and streams, which had provided irrigation for the abundant crops that characterize Vanir civilization, boiled away completely while leaving behind channels filled with superheated steam that killed any remaining vegetation. Muspelheim's expansion beyond its traditional boundaries occurred as Surtur's victory removed the magical constraints that had previously contained the fire realm's influence within specific cosmic limits. The realm's molten landscape began flowing into adjacent areas through passages created by Yggdrasil's collapse, carrying temperatures and atmospheric conditions that made survival impossible for beings not specifically adapted to extreme heat. The fire giants who had served as Surtur's army found their homeland expanding to encompass territories that had previously belonged to other realms, though the victory came at the cost of eliminating most other forms of life throughout the cosmic system. Helheim's destruction followed a different pattern as the advancing fires reached the cold depths where the goddess Hel had ruled over the dead for countless ages. The realm's misty atmosphere ignited when exposed to the cosmic flames, creating explosions that shattered the underground halls where the deceased had continued their shadowy existence. The goddess herself, whose half-living, half-dead nature had allowed her to serve as an intermediary between life and death, found both aspects of her being consumed by fires that recognized no distinction between animate and inanimate matter. The liberation of the dead from their underground existence occurred as Helheim's destruction broke down the barriers that had separated the living from the deceased, though this freedom came at the cost of their continued existence as conscious entities. The souls that had been preserved in the realm's cold environment evaporated like mist when exposed to the supernatural heat, their essence dispersing into the cosmic fires that would eventually consume all traces of the current universe's existence. Niflheim's ancient ice, which had existed since before the cosmos's creation and had served as one of the fundamental forces from which all reality had emerged, began sublimating directly into vapour when it encountered Surtur's fires. The realm's frozen wastes, which had remained unchanged throughout multiple cosmic ages, transformed into scalding deserts whose superheated atmosphere made survival impossible for any form of life. The primordial mists that had given the realm its name became toxic clouds that carried the concentrated essence of destruction across dimensional boundaries into realms that had not yet been directly touched by the advancing flames. The symbolic significance of fire and flood as dual agents of destruction drew upon Indo-European mythological traditions that viewed these elements as complementary forces capable of returning the universe to its primordial state before the emergence of organized reality. Fire represented the active principle of dissolution that consumed the material structures supporting civilized existence, while water embodied the passive principle of absorption that submerged and erased the achievements of previous ages. Together, these forces created conditions that eliminated all traces of the current cosmic order, while preparing the fundamental materials from which a new universe might eventually emerge. The purification aspect of this destruction reflected ancient beliefs that viewed cosmic renewal as requiring the complete elimination of accumulated corruption and decay that had developed over time within the existing order. The fires that consumed the 9 realms burned away not just physical structures, but also the spiritual and moral contamination that had made the current system unsustainable, while the floods that followed washed away the ashes and debris left by the conflagration. This cleansing process created a tabula rasa, upon which entirely new forms of existence could develop, without being constrained by the limitations and conflicts that had characterized the previous cosmic age. The universality of the destruction ensured that no aspect of the current reality would survive to influence whatever might emerge from Ragnarok's aftermath, as both the physical infrastructure of the 9 realms and the supernatural beings who had governed their operation faced complete annihilation. The elimination of gods, giants, elves, dwarfs, and humans created conditions where new forms of consciousness could develop without being overshadowed by the achievements or failures of their predecessors, while the destruction of the cosmic framework removed the structural limitations that had defined the boundaries of possible existence. The silence that followed the cosmic conflagration stretched across dimensions where time itself had lost meaning, as the fundamental forces that had governed reality since creation's beginning lay dormant in the aftermath of universal destruction. Yet, within this apparent void, processes beyond mortal comprehension began stirring as the same cosmic principles that had originally brought order from chaos started their work anew. The fires that had consumed everything had not destroyed the essential building blocks of existence, but had instead purified them, removing the accumulated corruption and decay that had made the previous cosmic order unsustainable. The first sign of renewal manifested as a subtle cooling in the superheated atmosphere that had replaced the 9 realms' diverse environments. This temperature reduction occurred gradually over periods that would have measured as centuries in the old temporal framework, though such measurements had become meaningless in a universe where the celestial bodies that had previously marked time's passage no longer existed. The cooling process followed patterns that suggested underlying intelligence rather than random thermal dynamics, as different regions experienced temperature drops that prepared them for specific types of regenerative growth. Water began returning to the transformed cosmos through processes that defied the physical laws that had governed the previous reality. Moisture condensed from the cooling atmosphere without requiring the presence of particulate matter that would normally serve as nucleation sites, while underground springs emerged from depths that had been thoroughly sterilized by the cosmic fires. These new water sources possessed properties that distinguished them from the liquids that had existed before Ragnarok, carrying within their molecular structure the potential for forms of life that had never previously existed. The emergence of land from the receding waters occurred with supernatural swiftness that compressed geological processes into time frames that would have been impossible under normal conditions. Mountain ranges thrust upward from the ocean floor with such force that their peaks pierced the cloud cover within days of their initial formation, while valleys carved themselves between the rising elevations as if guided by invisible hands that understood the optimal configurations for supporting diverse ecosystems. The new terrain displayed characteristics that combined the most favourable aspects of the destroyed realms, while eliminating the geographical barriers that had previously separated different regions. Soil formation proceeded through mechanisms that incorporated the ashes of the burned cosmos into fertile growing medium that possessed nutritional qualities exceeding anything that had existed in the previous world. The organic matter from countless destroyed forests, the mineral content from pulverized mountains, and the dissolved remains of supernatural beings combined to create Earth that could support plant growth of unprecedented abundance and variety. This soil displayed a rich black colour that reflected its origin in cosmic destruction, while possessing a texture that retained moisture without becoming waterlogged and provided perfect drainage during periods of heavy precipitation. The first vegetation to appear in this renewed world consisted of grasses that sprouted without seeds, their genetic information emerging directly from the transformed soil as if the earth itself remembered the essential patterns necessary for plant life. These initial growths displayed characteristics that had never been observed in pre-Ragnarok flora, with leaves that changed colour according to seasonal cycles that followed more complex patterns than the simple annual progressions that had characterised the old world. The grass grew with supernatural speed, while maintaining the robust root systems necessary for preventing soil erosion, creating stable foundations for the more complex plant communities that would follow. Trees began growing with equal rapidity, their forms combining features from the various species that had existed throughout the destroyed 9 realms, while displaying new characteristics that reflected their origin in the post-Ragnarok environment. These new forests included specimens that bore fruit throughout multiple seasons, providing continuous food sources for the animal life that would eventually populate the renewed world. The tree's wood possessed strength that exceeded the finest materials that had been available to craftsmen in the previous cosmic age, while their sap contained healing properties that could cure injuries and diseases that had previously been considered fatal. The return of animal life followed patterns that suggested careful planning rather than random evolutionary development, as species appeared in sequences that created balanced ecosystems from the moment of their introduction. Insects emerged first, their presence providing pollination services for the rapidly developing plant communities, while also beginning the decomposition processes necessary for maintaining soil fertility. Birds followed within days, their songs creating acoustic environments that had never existed in the old world, while their feeding habits helped distribute seeds across the expanding territories of habitable land. Larger animals appeared in populations that were already sustainable rather than starting from breeding pairs that would have required generations to establish viable numbers. Deer, elk, and other herbivores grazed in meadows that seemed designed specifically to support their dietary needs, while predator species maintained population balances that prevented overgrazing without creating the constant warfare between species that had characterized wildlife relationships in the previous world. These animals displayed intelligence levels that exceeded their pre-Ragnarok counterparts, showing problem-solving abilities and social cooperation that suggested evolutionary advancement compressed into impossibly short timeframes. The survival of Lif and Yggdrasil within Yggdrasil's protective embrace during the cosmic destruction represented one of the few direct continuities between the old and new worlds, though their experience of preservation had transformed them in ways that prepared them for their role as progenitors of renewed humanity. The World Tree's heartwood had provided not merely physical shelter, but also spiritual and genetic enhancement that equipped them with capabilities necessary for thriving in the transformed environment. Their bodies had absorbed essences from the tree's sap that granted them extended lifespans, enhanced physical abilities, and intuitive knowledge of the skills necessary for establishing civilization in the renewed world. Lif's appearance after emerging from their wooden sanctuary reflected both her human origins and the supernatural enhancement she had received during the preservation period. Her hair had taken on a golden colour that seemed to contain actual metallic threads, while her eyes displayed depth that suggested access to knowledge beyond normal human experience. Her skin possessed a luminescence that provided gentle illumination in darkness, while her movements carried a grace that indicated perfect physical coordination. Her voice, when she spoke, produced harmonious tones that could calm agitated animals and encourage plant growth through sonic vibrations that resonated with the natural frequencies of living organisms. Yggdrasil's transformation had followed similar patterns, while emphasizing different aspects of human potential, as his enhanced capabilities focused on practical skills and technological innovation, rather than the biological harmonies that characterized his companion's abilities. His hands had developed sensitivity that allowed him to work with materials at microscopic levels, while his mind had gained capacity for understanding complex systems and relationships that would prove essential for developing the infrastructure necessary to support expanding human populations. His physical strength exceeded normal human limits while remaining proportional to his frame, allowing him to perform tasks that would have required multiple workers in the previous world. Their initial activities in the renewed world involved exploring the transformed landscape, while learning to utilize the enhanced capabilities they had gained during their preservation within Yggdrasil's heartwood. They discovered that their nutritional needs had been reduced dramatically, as their enhanced metabolisms could extract sustenance from minimal food intake, while their bodies had gained the ability to supplement dietary nutrition through direct absorption of solar energy and atmospheric gases. This efficiency allowed them to focus their efforts on exploration and learning, rather than the constant food-gathering activities that had occupied much of human time in the previous world. The establishment of their first dwelling demonstrated the advanced construction techniques that their enhanced abilities made possible, as they created structures that incorporated living trees into architectural designs without damaging the plant's growth patterns. Their building methods utilized materials that were readily available in the renewed environment, while producing results that exceeded the durability and comfort of the finest constructions that had existed in the old world. The dwelling's design included features that regulated internal temperature and humidity automatically while providing protection against weather conditions that maintained comfort without requiring external energy sources. Their reproduction and the birth of their children occurred according to patterns that ensured genetic diversity despite their status as the sole human survivors of cosmic destruction. Their offspring displayed characteristics that suggested the presence of genetic information from multiple ancestral lines, rather than the limited diversity that would normally result from a population bottleneck involving only 2 individuals. These children matured rapidly while retaining the enhanced capabilities that their parents had gained, creating a human population that could expand quickly while maintaining the advanced abilities necessary for thriving in the post-Ragnarok environment. The development of human settlements proceeded with remarkable speed, as the expanding population discovered that the renewed world provided abundant resources while presenting fewer survival challenges than their ancestors had faced. The fertile soil produced crops that required minimal cultivation while yielding harvests that could support large populations, while the enhanced properties of available materials made construction projects achievable with smaller workforces and shorter time investments. The absence of hostile supernatural beings eliminated many of the dangers that had threatened human communities in the previous world, allowing settlements to develop without the extensive fortifications that had previously been necessary. The survival of certain gods represented another form of continuity between the old and new cosmic orders, though these divine beings had been transformed by their experience of witnessing universal destruction and renewal. Baldur's return from Helheim occurred automatically, as the realm's destruction eliminated the barriers that had prevented his resurrection, while his brother Hodra's accompanying revival reflected the cosmic justice that sought to balance the guilt and innocence that had characterized their relationship. Both gods emerged from death with enhanced understanding of the forces that governed existence, while retaining their essential divine natures and the abilities that had made them valuable members of the previous cosmic order. Baldur's appearance after his resurrection displayed the same luminous qualities that had characterized him before his death, though his radiance now carried additional depth that reflected his experience of mortality and rebirth. His knowledge had expanded to include understanding of death's nature and the processes involved in cosmic renewal, making him uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between the old and new realities. His emotional state combined the joy of renewed existence with the wisdom that came from experiencing loss and restoration, creating a personality that maintained his previous benevolence while adding the gravitas that came from surviving cosmic destruction. Hodra's restoration included the correction of the blindness that had afflicted him throughout his previous existence, as the cosmic renewal had eliminated the supernatural curse that had deprived him of sight. His new vision allowed him to perceive not just the physical world, but also the spiritual and magical forces that operated within the renewed cosmos, granting him abilities that complemented his brother's luminous nature. His personality retained the gentleness that had characterized him before Ragnarok, while adding confidence that came from his enhanced capabilities and his understanding of the role he was destined to play in the new cosmic order. Vidar and Vali, who had survived Ragnarok through their own combat prowess and divine resilience, emerged from the destruction with their abilities enhanced by their successful resistance to the forces that had overwhelmed their fellow gods. Vidar's thick boot, which had protected him during his battle with Fenrir, had absorbed properties from the cosmic fires that made it capable of walking safely across any terrain, while providing protection against supernatural threats that might emerge in the future. His strength had increased beyond its already formidable levels, while his knowledge of survival techniques had been expanded through his experience of enduring universal destruction. Vali's survival had been facilitated by his role as an agent of cosmic justice, as his purpose in avenging Baldur's death had aligned him with the forces of renewal rather than the destructive chaos that had consumed most of the old order. His abilities as a warrior had been enhanced through his experience of fighting during Ragnarok, while his understanding of justice had been deepened through witnessing the consequences of the moral decay that had preceded cosmic destruction. His personality combined the fierce determination that had characterized his original mission with the wisdom that came from understanding the broader implications of individual actions within cosmic frameworks. The emergence of Modi and Magni from their father Thor's legacy represented the continuation of divine power in forms adapted to the requirements of the new cosmic order. These sons of the Thunder God had inherited not only his physical strength and combat abilities, but also his protective instincts and his commitment to defending civilized order against chaotic forces. Their possession of Mjolnir, the hammer that had served their father throughout his divine career, provided them with a weapon whose capabilities had been enhanced by its exposure to cosmic destruction and renewal. Modi's appearance reflected his inheritance of Thor's physical characteristics, while displaying refinements that suggested evolution beyond his father's sometimes crude approach to problem-solving. His red hair and beard carried the same fiery quality that had characterized the Thunder God, while his build maintained the powerful musculature necessary for wielding Mjolnir effectively. His personality combined his father's courage and determination with enhanced diplomatic skills that made him more effective at building alliances and resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than combat. Magni's characteristics emphasized different aspects of Thor's legacy, as his inheritance focused on the intellectual and strategic elements of divine leadership rather than pure physical prowess. His appearance was more refined than his brother's, with features that suggested thoughtfulness and careful consideration rather than immediate action. His approach to wielding Mjolnir emphasized precision and efficiency over the overwhelming force that had characterized Thor's combat style, making him capable of achieving the same results with less collateral damage to surrounding environments. The sharing of Mjolnir between the two brothers created a partnership that combined their individual strengths, while eliminating the weaknesses that had occasionally limited their father's effectiveness. Their cooperation in wielding the hammer allowed them to coordinate their efforts in ways that produced results exceeding what either could have achieved individually, while their different approaches to leadership provided flexibility that made them capable of adapting to various challenges that might arise in the renewed world. The establishment of a new divine order proceeded through processes that incorporated lessons learned from the failures that had led to the previous cosmic order's destruction. The surviving gods recognized that the hierarchical structures and rigid, territorial boundaries that had characterized the old system had contributed to the conflicts that had made Ragnarok inevitable, leading them to develop more flexible and cooperative approaches to cosmic governance. Their new roles emphasized service to the renewed world rather than dominance over it, while their enhanced understanding of cosmic forces allowed them to work more effectively with natural processes rather than attempting to control them through divine authority. The relationship between the surviving gods and the renewed human population developed along lines that avoided the patron-client dependencies that had characterized divine mortal interactions in the previous world. The enhanced capabilities that humans had gained through their connection to Yggdrasil's preservation made them more nearly equal partners with divine beings rather than supplicants requiring constant protection and guidance. This equality created opportunities for collaboration that had been impossible when the power differential between gods and mortals had been too great to allow meaningful cooperation. The absence of giants, elves, and other supernatural beings that had populated the old cosmic order created opportunities for the development of new forms of consciousness that could fill ecological and social niches without carrying the historical grievances and conflicts that had destabilized the previous system. These new beings emerged gradually from the transformed environment, their characteristics reflecting the harmonious principles that governed the renewed world rather than the competitive and often hostile relationships that had characterized interspecies interactions before Ragnarok. The cyclical nature of time in Norse cosmology found expression in the renewal that followed destruction, though the new cosmic cycle incorporated improvements that suggested evolution, rather than mere repetition of previous patterns. The renewed world possessed characteristics that addressed the fundamental problems that had led to the old order's collapse, while maintaining the positive aspects that had made existence worthwhile for the beings who had inhabited the previous cosmos. This balance between continuity and change reflected the sophisticated understanding of cosmic principles that had guided the renewal process. The transformation represented by Ragnarok and the subsequent rebirth demonstrated that destruction could serve creative purposes when it eliminated obstacles to better forms of existence, rather than simply ending what had come before. The cosmic fires that had consumed the Nine Realms had also purified the essential materials from which new realities could be constructed, while the floods that had followed had washed away the debris of failed systems to create clean foundations for improved alternatives. This creative destruction reflected ancient wisdom that recognized renewal as requiring the complete elimination of corrupted systems rather than merely reforming their problematic elements. The hope embodied in the renewed world extended beyond simple survival to encompass the possibility of achieving forms of existence that transcended the limitations that had constrained previous cosmic orders. The enhanced capabilities of both divine and mortal beings created opportunities for achievements that would have been impossible under the old system, while the improved environmental conditions provided resources that could support more advanced civilizations than had previously been possible. The lessons learned from observing the consequences of moral decay and social conflict provided guidance for avoiding the mistakes that had led to cosmic destruction. The green and fertile earth that emerged from the waters represented not merely the restoration of agricultural productivity, but the establishment of conditions that could support indefinite growth and development without the resource limitations that had created competition and conflict in the previous world. The abundance that characterized the renewed environment eliminated the scarcity-based thinking that had motivated much of the destructive behavior that had preceded Ragnarok, while the enhanced properties of available materials made possible technological and cultural achievements that exceeded anything that had been accomplished before. The cosmic renewal that followed Ragnarok's destruction thus represented not an ending but a beginning, the establishment of conditions that could support forms of existence that transcended the limitations and conflicts that had made the previous cosmic order unsustainable. The survival of selected beings from the old world provided continuity with past achievements, while their transformation through the renewal process equipped them with capabilities necessary for building better futures. The hope that emerged from apparent ending demonstrated the fundamental resilience of existence itself, and the possibility that even the most complete destruction could serve ultimately creative purposes when guided by wisdom that understood the deeper patterns governing cosmic development.